Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where the quietest moments in history sometimes turn out to be the loudest ones, if you listen closely enough. Imagine a ship, not a grand one. Not the kind you might picture when you think of the age of exploration, with tall masts and painted figureheads, and a king's flag snapping in the wind. This one is small, roughly 20 metres from bow to stern, which is not much longer than a city bus. Its hull is dark and worn from months at sea. It carries 8 small cannons, a crew of around 20 men, and almost nothing in the way of certainty. No reliable chart for the waters ahead. No name for the coastline they are approaching. No real understanding of what they are sailing toward, or whether what they are sailing toward is anything at all. The year is early 1606. The ship is called the Duyfken, which in Dutch means little dove. And somewhere ahead of it, through shallow tidal water the colour of dark tea, through mangrove forests that stretch flat and low along the horizon, is the continent that would one day be called Australia. The men on board do not know that yet. They're not looking for a continent. They are looking for gold, or spices, or some kind of trade that might justify the voyage. They're employees, essentially, working for a company. And what they find, or rather what they fail to recognise, will take historians centuries to fully appreciate. Tonight we are going to follow that little ship. We are going to trace the journey of Willem Janszoon, the Dutch skipper who commanded the Duyfken, and who became, as best as the historical record can confirm, the first European to reach the Australian coast and set foot on it, or at least the first one we know about with any real documentary evidence. That qualifier matters, and we will come back to it. But before we get into the details, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you in bed, somewhere quiet, the room dark or nearly dark? Is it late at night or very early in the morning? Is it cold where you are, or warm? I always find it interesting to think about the different places and times a single voice can reach. Someone listening in a winter apartment in Northern Europe, someone else on a humid night in Queensland, maybe someone driving a long empty road somewhere in the middle of the night. All of us, in our different weathers, following the same small ship through the same dark water. If this kind of storytelling is something you enjoy, something that makes a long night feel a little more interesting, I would gently ask you to consider leaving a like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who might enjoy it too. And if you are new here, subscribing means you will not miss the next one. There is no pressure in that, just a quiet invitation. Now, back to the ship. The Duyfken departed from Bantam, a major trading port on the northwest coast of Java, in November of 1605. Bantam was one of the most important commercial hubs in Southeast Asia at that time, a place where pepper was traded by the ton, where merchants from Portugal, England, China and the Dutch Republic jostled for position, where fortunes were made and ships were lost, and the air apparently smelled of spice and salt and something hard to name. It was the kind of place that operated at a constant, exhausting intensity. Everyone there was chasing something. The Dutch had arrived in the region with serious commercial ambitions and had, just 3 years earlier, in 1602, organised those ambitions into one of the most powerful corporate structures the world had yet seen. The Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. We will spend more time with this organisation in the next part of the story, because understanding the VOC is really the key to understanding why this voyage happened at all. The Duyfken did not sail into unknown waters because anyone was feeling particularly adventurous or romantic about exploration. It sailed because the VOC needed information. It needed to know what was out there, what could be traded, what could be taken, what could be turned into profit. That is the engine behind this story. Not heroism, not curiosity for its own sake, not the noble pursuit of knowledge. Commerce. The spice trade specifically, which in the early 17th century was one of the most lucrative and violently contested businesses on earth. Nutmeg from the Bande Islands, cloves from Maluku, pepper from Java and Sumatra. These were not just pleasant flavours. In Europe, spices were worth extraordinary sums. They preserved food, they masked the taste of meat that had gone slightly off, they were used in medicine. A small sack of nutmeg could pay a sailor's wages for months. Control over the spice routes was worth going to war over, and the Portuguese and Spanish and Dutch and English all understood that perfectly well. So when the VOC sent the Duyfken south, it was not sending it on a voyage of wonder. It was sending it on a reconnaissance mission. Find out what is down there. Find out if there is anything worth having. Come back with useful information. The orders Janszoon received, as best we can reconstruct them, were to sail south along the coast of New Guinea, look for any sign of gold-bearing lands or potential trading partners, and report back. That was the job. It sounds almost mundane when you put it that way. And yet, what makes this voyage so quietly remarkable is the gap between what it was supposed to be and what it turned out to be. A small ship sent on a commercial errand became the first documented European contact with an entire continent. A voyage that the VOC considered a failure because it came back with nothing to sell turned out to be one of the most historically significant journeys of the 17th century. History has a habit of doing that. The moments that end up mattering most are often the ones nobody thought to celebrate at the time. The Duyfken left Bantam and made its way south and east, through the Arafura Sea, along the southern coast of New Guinea, through waters that were only partially charted and partially understood. The Portuguese had been through some of these routes before, and their charts existed, though the Dutch did not always have access to them or trust them entirely. The further south and east the Duyfken went, the thinner the available information became. There were rumours and speculation about what lay beyond New Guinea. Marco Polo had written about a place called Locash, or Beach, a land supposedly rich in gold somewhere to the south. Whether any of the men on the Duyfken were thinking about Marco Polo as they sailed is impossible to know. But the idea of a great southern land, a terra australis incognita, had been circulating in European geographical thinking for a long time. It appeared on maps as a theoretical mass, a counterweight to the land masses of the Northern Hemisphere, something that had to be there because the world needed to be balanced. Nobody had found it yet, or nobody had found it and come back to say so clearly. The Duyfken was heading in that direction. 20 men, 20 metres of wooden hull, 8 guns, and a hold that was probably carrying supplies and trade goods and the kinds of tools you bring when you expect to encounter people you might want to do business with. The crew would have been a mix of Dutch officers and sailors, quite possibly Asian sailors as well, since VOC ships in this region regularly employed local mariners who knew the waters and the winds better than any European could. There may have been Malay interpreters on board, men who could speak to the peoples of New Guinea and the surrounding islands. Whether those interpreters would be of any use further south was another question entirely. As the Duyfken moved east along the New Guinea coast, and then began to turn south, the crew was moving off the edge of what any European chart could tell them. The coast of New Guinea gave way to open water, and then, somewhere in the shallow seas between New Guinea and the land that lay beyond, the little dove crossed into genuinely uncharted territory. Not uncharted in the dramatic movie sense, where someone gasps and the music swells, just quietly, practically, factually unknown. They were in water that no European ship had recorded. Ahead of them, though they could not yet see it, was a coastline that stretched for thousands of kilometres, a continent that had been home to human beings for at least 65,000 years, possibly longer. A place with its own languages, its own knowledge of the land, its own names for every river and headland and seasonal wind. A place that did not need to be discovered, because the people who lived there had never lost it. But from the perspective of the Duyfken and its crew, they were looking at something that had no name in any language they knew, and in early 1606, probably around March, they found it. Most historians place the Duyfken's landfall on the western coast of Cape York Peninsula, in what is now the far north of Queensland, Australia. The area near the Pennefather River is often cited. The landscape there is flat and low, edged with dense mangrove forests. cut through with tidal channels and mudflats that shift with the season. It is not a dramatic coastline. There are no towering cliffs, no obvious natural harbours, no glittering rivers of the kind that might suggest gold nearby. It is quiet and green and brown and wide, and the water along the shore is shallow and the colour of river mud, because it is carrying sediment from the land. The crew of the Duyfken would have looked at this coast and felt something. We cannot know exactly what. Caution, probably. Curiosity, maybe. Disappointment, perhaps, if they had been hoping for something more obviously promising. This did not look like a land of gold. It looked like a coast of mangroves and tidal flats and hot, heavy air. But they had found something. Something real and unmapped and worth recording. And so they began to sail along it, mapping as they went, giving Dutch names to the features they passed, trying to understand the shape of what they were looking at. What they did not understand, and what would not be understood for years afterward, was that this coast was not a southern extension of New Guinea. It was something else entirely. A continent. The southernmost one in the world, as it turned out, if you set aside Antarctica. But that realisation was still a long way off. For now, the Duyfken moved along the coast, the crew watching the shore watching back. Because there were people there, Aboriginal Australians who had lived on this land for longer than almost any other continuous human culture anywhere on Earth. The Wick people and related groups of Western Cape York Peninsula. People who had their own understanding of the sea, who had seen strange things before perhaps, but probably nothing quite like this. A small wooden vessel with sails moving along their coastline, carrying men whose skin and clothing and intentions were entirely foreign. What happened when these two worlds met was not peaceful. The records that survive, fragmentary and filtered through VOC bureaucracy, tell us that at least 10 of Janszoon's crew were killed in conflicts with Aboriginal people along the coast. 10 men out of a crew of around 20. That is a devastating number. Half the crew, or close to it. The details of these encounters are mostly lost. The Duyfken's own journal does not survive in a complete form. What we know comes from later references, including a 1618 deposition by another Dutch navigator named Jan Carstens, who mentioned the earlier voyage and its losses. The violence was almost certainly the result of misunderstanding, fear, and the collision of two completely different frameworks for what was happening. The Duyfken's crew needed fresh water, possibly food. They would have tried to land. The Aboriginal people would have had no context for who these men were or what they wanted. There was no shared language, no interpreter who could bridge that gap. Whatever signals were exchanged, they were not understood on either side. It is one of the quieter tragedies of this story. Not quiet because it was small, but quiet because it happened so far from anywhere that anyone in Europe would write about, and because the people on both sides of those encounters left so little record that we are left largely guessing at the details. What we do know is that the Duyfken eventually turned back. The coast was shallow, the crew was diminished, the supplies were running low, and there was nothing to bring home that the VOC would consider worth the cost of the voyage. Janszoon pointed the Duyfken north, back toward New Guinea and then back toward Bantam, carrying with him a chart of a coastline that no European had mapped before, and a belief, which turned out to be wrong, that the land he'd found was connected to New Guinea. That chart and that misunderstanding and the quiet bureaucratic silence that greeted the voyage when it returned are where the real story of the Duyfken begins to get complicated. But to understand all of that, we need to go back a little further first, back to the world that built the Duyfken, funded the voyage, and decided what counted as success or failure. Back to Amsterdam in 1602, and the creation of the most powerful trading company in the history of the world up to that point. Because the VOC is not just the backdrop to this story. In many ways, it is the reason the story exists at all. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company. Even the name has a kind of weight to it, a sense of something assembled from many parts and pointed in a single direction. It was chartered by the States General of the Dutch Republic in March of 1602. and from the moment of its founding it was unlike anything that had existed before in the commercial world. Not just a company in the modern sense, not just a group of merchants pooling their money for a single voyage and then dividing the profits. The VOC was something more permanent, more institutional, more deliberately powerful. It had a monopoly granted by the Dutch government on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. That is to say, it had legal control over an enormous portion of the world's most profitable trade routes, and the authority to enforce that control with its own ships, its own soldiers, and its own courts. The initial capital raised for the VOC was around 6.5 million guilders. That number is hard to make intuitive across 4 centuries of inflation and economic change, but what it tells you is that this was not a small venture. It was a serious, organised, heavily funded enterprise, drawing investment from merchants across the Dutch Republic, and crucially, it issued shares. Tradable shares, which made it something like the world's first publicly traded company. People in Amsterdam could buy a stake in the VOC and hope to profit from whatever the company brought back from the other side of the world. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which opened around the same time, existed in large part to trade those shares. There is something almost strange about that when you sit with it. The voyage of the Duyfken and the first European contact with Australia ultimately traces back to a financial instrument that ordinary Dutch citizens could buy and sell in a marketplace. The spice trade in the early 17th century was not an abstraction. It was one of the most lucrative and fiercely contested commercial activities in the world. Nutmeg, cloves, mace, pepper. These were not simply flavouring for food. They were preservatives in an era before refrigeration. They were medicine, or at least widely believed to be. They were status symbols. A quantity of nutmeg that could fit in your palm was worth more than most European workers earned in a week. The Banda Islands, a tiny volcanic archipelago in what is now eastern Indonesia, were essentially the only place in the world where nutmeg and mace grew naturally. The Moluccas produced cloves. These were not commodities that could be sourced elsewhere. If you controlled the islands, you controlled the supply. And if you controlled the supply, you could set the price anywhere in Europe. The Portuguese had understood this first. They arrived in the Spice Islands in the early 16th century and spent decades trying to establish a monopoly of their own. The Spanish came at it from the other direction, through the Pacific. By the time the Dutch entered the picture seriously, in the 1590s the Portuguese had been at it for nearly 100 years, and the competition was brutal and expensive and sometimes violent. The Dutch were not newcomers to trade. They were experienced merchants, skilled navigators, and deeply motivated by the mathematics of profit. The VOC was their organised answer to the question of how to compete with the Portuguese and Spanish empires without the backing of a monarchy or a global network of established colonies. The answer was, pool the capital, issue the monopoly, build the ships, and go. Bantam, on the northwestern coast of Java, was the VOC's primary base of operations in the early years. It was a major pepper port, one of the most important trading cities in Southeast Asia at the time, and the Dutch had established a significant presence there by the early 1600s. The Governor-General overseeing VOC operations in the region during the period leading up to Janszoon's voyage was Stephen van der Hagen, who had arrived in the East Indies in 1604 with a fleet of 11 ships and immediately set about expanding Dutch influence. He was followed by Peter Both, who became the first official Governor-General of the VOC's Eastern Territories in 1609. These were administrators and military commanders as much as merchants. Running the VOC's eastern operations meant negotiating with local rulers, fighting the Portuguese when necessary, managing a network of trading posts across thousands of kilometres of ocean, and constantly looking for new opportunities. And that is where the idea of unknown southern lands enters the picture. Not as a romantic dream of exploration, not as a philosophical question about the shape of the world, as a commercial calculation. For centuries, European geographers had speculated about a large landmass in the southern hemisphere. The ancient Greek idea of a symmetrical world, balance between north and south, had never quite gone away. Medieval and Renaissance maps often showed a vast continent at the bottom of the world labelled Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Some of these maps were elaborate and confident-looking, others were more tentative. But the idea persisted, and by the early 17th century it had taken on a specifically commercial flavour. If such a land existed, and if it was large and populated and rich, it might offer trade goods, or gold, or at least new routes. It was a possibility worth investigating, in the same pragmatic spirit that you might investigate a rumour of a new supplier or an untapped market. The VOC was not sending ships south out of curiosity about the world's geography. It was sending them because there might be something profitable down there. This is actually an important thing to understand about the Duyfken's voyage. It was not conceived as a great voyage of discovery. It was conceived as a scouting mission, a small ship sent ahead of any large commitment to see if there was anything worth following up on. The choice of a small vessel was deliberate. The Duyfken was not a flagship. It was not a warship or a heavy cargo carrier. It was a pinnace, or something close to one, a lightly built, shallow-drafted vessel, the kind of ship you sent into unknown coastal waters precisely because it could navigate shallows that would ground a larger ship. It was fast enough to run if it encountered trouble, small enough to be risked on an uncertain mission. If the Duyfken found nothing, the VOC had lost a small ship and a small crew. If it found something, a larger expedition could follow. The economics of this decision were straightforward. Sending a fleet of heavy ships into completely uncharted waters was expensive and dangerous. Sending one small expendable vessel first was rational. The VOC was not sentimental about its ships or its sailors, but it was careful with its capital. A scouting voyage cost a fraction of what a full expedition would cost, and it generated information that could guide future investment. This is the logic that produced the Duyfken's voyage, and it is the logic that would also explain the VOC's reaction when the voyage returned, but we will get to that. The spice trade was also intensely competitive in ways that shaped how the VOC handled geographic information. Charts, in the early 17th century, were not public documents. They were not published in books or shared between nations. They were closely guarded commercial secrets. A chart showing a new route, a new anchorage, a new coastline was worth real money. The Portuguese had spent decades accumulating charts of the Indian Ocean and the Spice Islands, and they treated that knowledge as proprietary. The Dutch did the same. When the Duyfken returned from its voyage along the Australian coast, the chart it produced was filed in the VOC's archives. It was not published, it was not circulated, it was commercial intelligence, and it was treated accordingly. This is one of the reasons the voyage remained so obscure for so long. Not because no one cared, but because the organisation that owned the information had no interest in sharing it. There is something almost counterintuitive about this, from a modern perspective. We tend to think of great geographic discoveries as public events, celebrated, announced, commemorated. But in the world of the VOC, a new coastline was a trade secret. The company's monopoly charter meant that only the VOC could act on geographic information about the eastern trade routes anyway. So there was no incentive to publicise what the Duyfken found. The information went into the files, and the world outside the VOC's offices knew nothing about it. Bantam itself in 1605 was a busy and cosmopolitan place. The port hosted merchants from across Asia, Javanese, Malay, Chinese, Indian, Arab, as well as Portuguese, English and Dutch. It was not a quiet colonial outpost. It was a working trading city, full of competing interests and overlapping commercial networks. The VOC's presence there was significant but not unchallenged. The English East India Company had its own factory in Bantam. The Portuguese were still active in the region. The local Sultanate of Banten had its own interests and was perfectly capable of playing European powers against each other when it suited them. This was the environment from which the Duyfken departed in November of 1605. Not from a quiet harbour at the edge of the known world, but from the middle of a busy, competitive, commercially charged port city, where information and ships and money moved constantly. When the Duyfken left Bantam and headed south and east, it was carrying orders that reflected exactly this commercial mindset. Find the coast of New Guinea, follow it south, look for gold-bearing lands, look for trading opportunities, report back. The orders were practical and specific, and they contained no particular instruction to map a new continent or make contact with unknown peoples in any formal or ceremonial way. This was a reconnaissance mission, framed entirely in the language of commerce. Find out if there is anything worth coming back for. What the VOC did not know, and what no European knew, was that the coast of New Guinea did not continue southward in a single unbroken line. There was a gap, the Torres Strait, roughly 150 kilometres wide at its narrowest point, separating New Guinea from a landmass that was not New Guinea at all. The Duyfken, sailing south along the New Guinea coast, and then apparently crossing into Australian waters without fully recognising the transition, would sail along a coast that its crew believed was still New Guinea, or at least connected to it. That misidentification would persist for years, but it does not change what they actually found. It just changes what they thought they had found, which is a distinction that matters a great deal when you're trying to understand what the voyage meant to the people who made it. The world that produced Willem Janszoon and the Duyfken was a world organised around profit, competition, and the careful management of geographic knowledge as a commercial asset. It was not a world that celebrated discovery for its own sake. It was a world that asked, immediately and practically, what can we do with this? And when the answer turned out to be not much, at least not yet, the voyage was filed away and the ship was sent somewhere else. That is the context in which the first European contact with Australia happened, not in the glow of royal patronage or the drama of a famous expedition, but in the quiet, business-like operations of a trading company trying to find new sources of profit in the southern seas. And yet, despite all of that, despite the commercial logic and the bureaucratic silence and the lack of any celebration, the voyage of the Duyfken was real. The coast was real. The encounters were real. The chart, however imperfect, was real. And the man who commanded the vessel, whose name appears in the VOC's records and on the chart and in later depositions, but almost nowhere else, was real too. Which brings us to Willem Janszoon himself, because the world that sent him is one thing. The man who actually went is another. And what little we know about him, and how much we do not know, is in some ways the most quietly strange part of this whole story. Willem Janszoon. The name appears in the historical record the way a figure appears at the edge of a photograph. Present, clearly there, but slightly out of focus. You can see enough to confirm he existed. You cannot see enough to know him. And that gap between existence and understanding is, in its own quiet way, one of the most interesting things about this entire voyage. What we know for certain is relatively straightforward. Janszoon was an employee of the VOC. He held the rank of shipper, which translates roughly as skipper or ship's commander, not the highest rank in the VOC's hierarchy, but a position of real authority and practical responsibility. He was the man who gave orders on the Duyfken. He was the man who read the charts, such as they were, and decided which direction to sail. He was, in the most literal and meaningful sense, the person in command of the first documented European landing on Australian soil. And yet his birthplace is unknown. His birth year is unknown. His face is unknown. No portrait survives if one was ever made. His own words, as far as historians have been able to find, do not survive in any personal account. He left no memoir, no diary, no letter home that has been recovered. What we have are references to him in other documents, VOC ledgers, ship logs, depositions made by other people years later that mention what the Duyfken found. Janszoon himself is present in the record the way a shadow is present. You can tell something was there, but the thing itself has moved on. This is not entirely unusual for men of his rank and era. The early 17th century was not a time when shipmasters wrote personal memoirs for publication. The VOC employed hundreds of men like Janszoon, competent, experienced, practical sailors who did their jobs, filed their reports, collected their pay, and went home. The ones who became famous were mostly famous for other reasons: a particularly dramatic discovery, a particularly catastrophic shipwreck, a particularly violent conflict. Janszoon's voyage, as we will see, was treated by the VOC as a disappointment, and disappointments do not generate the kind of documentation that fame does. What we can piece together about his earlier career is modest, but useful. Before the Duyfken voyage, Janszoon had already been operating in the eastern waters for the VOC for several years. In 1603, he was involved in a voyage to the Banda Islands, the same cluster of small islands that produced the nutmeg that the VOC was so eager to control. This tells us something practical. Janszoon knew these waters. He had navigated the complex reef-scattered passages of the eastern Indonesian archipelago before. He understood the monsoon patterns, the tidal behaviour, the way the sea changed colour as you move from deep water into the shallows around island groups. He was not a man being sent into unfamiliar conditions for the first time. He was an experienced regional sailor being given a new task at the edge of what was known. His appointment to command the Duyfken for the 1605 voyage suggests that the VOC trusted his judgment and his seamanship. The mission was not without risk. Sailing south from New Guinea into waters that no Dutch navigator had recorded was genuinely uncertain work. The VOC did not send its worst men to do uncertain work. They sent people who had demonstrated they could manage a ship and a crew in difficult conditions and bring both back in reasonable shape. Janszoon, by that measure, was a reasonable choice. The Duyfken itself deserves a moment of attention, because the ship is in some ways as important to this story as the man who commanded it. The name means little dove in Dutch, which is a rather gentle name for a vessel that was, in practical terms, a working warship and scout ship simultaneously. It was a pinnace, or more precisely a type of small flute vessel, roughly 20 metres in length. To put that in perspective, 20 metres is about the length of a large house. It is not a grand ship. It is not the kind of vessel that would inspire awe in a harbour. It was compact, relatively fast, and importantly it had a shallow draft. That last quality mattered enormously for coastal exploration. A ship with a shallow draft can navigate in water that would ground a larger vessel. It can get closer to an unknown shore, feel its way along a coastline without immediately running into a reef or a sandbar. For the kind of work Janszoon was being sent to do, hugging the coast of New Guinea and looking for useful things, the Duyfken was a sensible choice precisely because of its smallness. It carried 8 guns, which made it lightly armed by the standards of VOC warships, but not defenceless. A crew of around 20 men, though some accounts suggest the number may have been slightly higher at departure. The crew would have included Dutch officers, a mate or two, a navigator, a carpenter, and almost certainly a number of Asian sailors, likely Malay or Javanese, who were routinely employed by the VOC on regional voyages. It is also possible that the Duyfken carried Malay-speaking interpreters, since the VOC used Malay as a trade language throughout the archipelago. Whether those interpreters would have been of any use along the coast of New Guinea or, as it turned out, Australia, is another question. The languages spoken by the peoples of those coasts were entirely different from anything a Malay interpreter would have known. But the VOC's expectation, when the voyage was planned, was that they would be sailing along coasts where Malay might serve as a bridge language. That assumption was reasonable given what they expected to find. It just turned out to be wrong about what they actually found. The orders Janszoon received before departing have not survived in their original form, but their substance can be reconstructed from later documents and from the general pattern of VOC instructions for exploratory voyages. He was to sail south from Bantam, proceed along the coast of New Guinea, and look for gold-bearing lands and opportunities for trade. There had been persistent rumours, some originating from Portuguese sources, some from local Malay traders, that the lands south of New Guinea contained gold. The VOC was interested in gold in the same uncomplicated way that any trading company is interested in gold. It would be useful to have some. The instruction to look for trading opportunities was equally practical. If there were peoples living along the southern coast of New Guinea who had goods worth buying or selling, the VOC wanted to know about it. What the orders did not include, as far as historians can tell, was any instruction to claim land on behalf of the Dutch Republic, or to formally annex territory, or to do anything ceremonial at all. This was not a voyage of imperial declaration. It was a voyage of commercial reconnaissance. Go look, come back, tell us what you found. Hell. The VOC would decide what to do with the information. This distinction matters because it shapes what Janszoon actually did when he reached the Australian coast. He did not plant a flag. He did not read a proclamation. He mapped the coastline, attempted to gather information about the land and its people, and eventually turned back when the situation made continuing impractical. The whole framing of the voyage was investigative, not declaratory. There is something quietly interesting about the contrast between the scale of what Janszoon accomplished and the administrative ordinariness of the instructions he was given. He was told, essentially, to go have a look around, and in the course of doing that, he became the first documented European to reach the continent of Australia. The orders did not say anything about finding a new continent, because no one knew there was a new continent to find. The orders were written in the language of the known world, and Janszoon sailed out of the known world entirely into something the orders had no category for. This is one of the things that makes the Duyfken voyage so different in character from, say, Columbus's first crossing, or Vasco da Gama's rounding of the Cape of Good Hope. Those voyages were organised around a specific geographic hypothesis. There is something out there, and we're going to find it. Janszoon's voyage was organised around a commercial task, and the discovery of Australia was almost incidental to that task. He was following the coast of New Guinea south, as instructed, and at some point the coast of New Guinea became the coast of Australia, without anyone on the Duyfken fully realising the transition had occurred. The discovery happened in a sense while Janszoon was doing something else. What he would have known, as he stood on the deck of the Duyfken in the weeks before departure, was the outline of the task in front of him. He had a ship he knew, he had a crew he could manage, he had orders he understood, he had charts of the region, partial, imperfect, assembled from Portuguese sources and Dutch observations, that showed the coast of New Guinea extending southward into uncertain territory. He had the monsoon season to work with and against, and he had whatever personal qualities had gotten him this far in the VOC's service. Competence, steadiness, the ability to make decisions in conditions where the right answer was not obvious. What he did not have was any sense that he was about to do something history would remember. That is almost certainly true. Men in his position, in his era, in the service of a trading company that measured success in guilders and pepper and nutmeg, did not think in terms of historical legacy. They thought in terms of the voyage in front of them, the crew behind them, and the report they would have to file when they got back. Janszoon's inner life, as such as we can imagine it, was probably organised around practical concerns rather than grand ones. Where is the water shallow? What is the weather doing? How many days of provisions do we have? These are the questions that fill a ship's day, and they leave little room for the kind of reflection that makes a man feel like he is standing at a historic moment. And yet he was. Standing at a historic moment, that is. The voyage that would carry his name, the name that most Australians, if they know it at all, know only vaguely, was about to begin. The Duyfken was being provisioned and prepared in Bantam Harbour. The crew was assembling. The monsoon season was moving into the position that would make the southern passage possible. And Willem Janszoon, skipper, VOC employee, man of unknown birthplace and unknown face, was preparing to sail off the edge of the known world and onto the coast of a continent that no European had ever recorded seeing. The chart he would eventually produce, imperfect, misattributed in its geography but real, would show a coastline that no European chart had shown before. His name would appear on it, connected to the voyage, connected to the Duyfken, and then the chart would go into the VOC's files and the world would move on, and Janszoon would continue his career, and the coast he had mapped would wait quietly for the next European ship to arrive. But before any of that could happen, the Duyfken had to actually leave Bantam and make its way south and east through the familiar waters of the Indonesian archipelago, into the less familiar waters near New Guinea, and then into the completely unfamiliar waters beyond. That journey, what the crew saw, what the charts showed them, and what it felt like to move past the last edge of recorded geography, is where the story goes next. The Duyfken left Bantam sometime in November of 1605. The exact date is not recorded, which is fitting in a way because almost nothing about this voyage was recorded with the kind of careful ceremony that later generations would have wished for. There was no formal send-off noted in the documents that survive, no speech, no crowd on the dock, no entry in a diary describing the feeling of departure. The ship simply left, as ships did when the conditions and the orders aligned. And the conditions in November 1605 were, broadly speaking, correct for the route Janszoon needed to take. The monsoon cycle in this part of the world is the underlying rhythm of everything. It dictates when ships can move, in which direction, and through which passages. The northwest monsoon, which blows roughly from November through March, was the wind that made a southward voyage from Bantam toward New Guinea, and beyond both possible and, in some stretches, relatively fast. Janszoon would have known this timing well. He had been sailing these waters for years. The monsoon was not a mystery to him, it was a schedule. The route south from Bantam, which sat on the northwest coast of Java, took the Duyfken eastward through the Java Sea and then into the broader waters of the Banda Sea. This was not unfamiliar territory. The VOC had been moving ships through this corridor since the company's founding just 3 years earlier, and the Portuguese had been doing it for a century before that. There were charts of these waters, imperfect but serviceable. There were known anchorages, known hazards, known currents. The Banda Islands themselves, the source of the nutmeg that made men rich and drove companies to build fleets, lay along this route, and Janszoon had been to the Bandas before. In 1603, he had sailed there on an earlier VOC mission. So the first part of the voyage was, in the context of his experience, routine. The crew of the Duyfken was probably around 20 men, possibly a few more. The exact number is not confirmed. What is fairly certain is that the composition would have been mixed. Dutch officers and navigators at the top of the hierarchy, and below them a combination of European sailors, possibly some from other parts of Northern Europe, and very likely a number of Asian sailors as well. The VOC routinely employed men from across maritime Asia, Javanese sailors, Malay sailors, men from the Banda Islands and elsewhere, who knew these waters from their own traditions of navigation. There may also have been Malay-speaking interpreters on board because Malay functioned as a trade language across much of maritime Southeast Asia at this time. When the Duyfken reached New Guinea, a Malay interpreter might have been useful for communicating with coastal communities. Whether any such interpreter was actually aboard is not confirmed, but it would have been consistent with VOC practice. The charts Janszoon carried were assembled from Portuguese sources and whatever the Dutch had gathered in their own voyages over the preceding years. Portuguese navigators had been working in this part of the world since the early 16th century, and they had produced charts of considerable detail for some areas, the Moluccas, the Banda Islands, the northern coast of New Guinea, and very little detail for others. The southern coast of New Guinea was known in rough outline. Beyond that, the charts became increasingly vague, increasingly speculative. One of the more curious elements of those charts was the presence of a land called Beach, sometimes written as Buich or Lokash, which appeared on European maps of the region based ultimately on Marco Polo's 13th century account of his travels. Marco Polo had described a rich southern land with gold, and European cartographers had placed this land somewhere in the general vicinity of the unknown southern seas. By the early 17th century, most serious navigators probably regarded Beach with a degree of scepticism. It was one of those inherited geographic names that had been copied from map to map without anyone actually going to verify whether it existed. But it was still there on the charts, still suggesting that somewhere to the south there might be something worth finding. Gold-bearing lands, rich trading partners. The language of the VOC's orders to Janszoon, find gold, find trade, echoes this older tradition of expectation, even if no one on the Duyfken was literally sailing toward a place called Beach. The coast of New Guinea, as the Duyfken moved along it heading south and east, would have presented a particular kind of navigational challenge. New Guinea is a large island, the second largest in the world in fact, with a long southern coastline that faces toward the Arafura Sea, and beyond that toward Australia. That southern coastline is not easy sailing. It is low and marshy in many places, edged with mangroves, cut through with river mouths that spread silt and shallow water far out to sea. The watercolour changes as you approach. It goes from the deep blue of open ocean to a murkier brown-green as the land's influence takes over. Depths can drop quickly and unpredictably. Reefs are not always visible. The Duyfken's shallow draft, one of the reasons a small ship had been chosen for this mission, would have been an advantage here, allowing the crew to work closer to shore than a larger vessel could safely manage. But shallow draft does not mean immunity from running aground, and the crew would have been sounding constantly, dropping a weighted line over the side to measure the depth beneath the keel. At some point along this southward passage, the Duyfken would have been sailing through waters that no European ship had charted. The transition was not marked by any visible boundary, of course. The sea looked the same, the sky looked the same. The mangrove-edged coastline continued as it had been continuing, but the Portuguese charts that Janszoon carried would have shown the coastline becoming less certain, the names fewer, the detail thinner, and then, at some point, the chart would have simply run out. The coastline on the paper would end, or fade into a vague dotted line, or simply stop, replaced by blank space, and perhaps a note in Latin or Portuguese acknowledging that what lay beyond was unknown. Moving off the edge of a chart is a strange thing to try to imagine from the comfortable distance of the present. We live in a world where every coastline has been mapped to within meters, where satellite imagery shows every reef and river mouth in real time, where the idea of genuinely unknown geography has been effectively abolished. For Janszoon and his crew, it was a real and practical experience. The chart stopped being useful. The lead line and the lookout and the judgment of the navigator became the only tools available. Every decision about where to sail, whether to approach the coast or stand off, whether to anchor or keep moving, had to be made on the basis of direct observation and accumulated experience rather than recorded knowledge. This is not, to be clear, a unique situation for sailors of that era. Coastal exploration was a common enough activity, and experienced navigators were trained for it. But there is still something worth pausing on in the image of the Duyfken's crew working their way south through waters that no European had described, making notes, making soundings, making the chart that would eventually show a coastline where the charts had previously shown nothing. The Torres Strait, the body of water that separates New Guinea from Australia, is roughly 150 kilometres wide at its narrowest point, but it is extraordinarily shallow and reef-studded, and its navigational complexity is not obvious from a distance. From the west, approaching from the direction the Duyfken was coming, the strait does not announce itself clearly. The islands and reefs that fill it can make the southern coast of New Guinea and the northern tip of Australia appear, at certain angles and in certain light conditions, to be a single continuous landmass. This is almost certainly part of what happened with Janszoon. He did not recognise the Torres Strait as a strait. He appears to have continued following what he believed was the coast of New Guinea southward, not realising that at some point, possibly around the area of the Pennefather River on the western Cape York Peninsula, the coastline he was following had become a different landmass entirely. The exact moment of transition is impossible to pin down with certainty, because the Duyfken's original journal has not survived. What historians have reconstructed comes from the chart produced after the voyage, from later references in VOC documents, and from a 1618 deposition by Jan Carstens, who led a subsequent Dutch voyage to the same region and referenced the Duyfken's earlier exploration. From these sources, historians have been able to establish the broad outline of what happened, but the fine details, the day-by-day account of what the crew saw and did, are gone. What the landscape would have looked like, though, can be described with some confidence, because Cape York Peninsula has not changed dramatically in 4 centuries. The western coast of Cape York, facing the Gulf of Carpentaria, is low and flat, very low. In some places, the land rises only a metre or 2 above the high tide line. The vegetation near the shore is dominated by mangroves, dense, tangled, salt-adapted trees that form a nearly impenetrable wall along the water's edge. Behind the mangroves, the land opens into tropical savanna, eucalyptus woodland, grassland, the occasional paperbark swamp. The rivers that drain into the Gulf of Carpentaria along this stretch of coast, the Archer, the Wenlock, the Pennefather, run brown with tannins and sediment, spreading mudflats at their mouths that extend well out into the sea. The water in the shallows is not the clear blue of a tropical postcard. It is brown and opaque, and the bottom is soft mud. For a crew that had been sailing through the Banda Islands and along the coast of New Guinea, a landscape of dramatic volcanic peaks, dense tropical forest and deep blue water, Cape York Peninsula would have seemed strikingly flat and featureless. There were no obvious signs of the gold-bearing lands the VOC's orders had mentioned. There were no coastal settlements of the kind that indicated trade networks. There were no spice plants. The land was not uninhabited. There were people here, as the crew would soon discover, but it did not look from the water like the kind of place that would repay a trading company's investment. The Duyfken's crew would have been looking for the same things any exploring ship looked for: fresh water, food, signs of population, signs of resources. Fresh water was always the most pressing need on a long coastal voyage. The rivers of Cape York could provide it, but getting to river water meant getting close to shore, which meant shallow water and the risk of grounding, and it meant sending men ashore in a small boat, which meant exposure to whatever the land contained. Every time a ship's boat was lowered and rowed toward an unknown shore, the men in it were taking a risk that the charts could not quantify. The crew's composition at this stage of the voyage is worth thinking about for a moment. These were not soldiers or explorers in the romantic sense. They were sailors and tradesmen, men who worked for a company and expected to be paid for their labour. Some of them had probably volunteered for this particular voyage, knowing it involved exploration into uncertain waters. Others may have simply been assigned. They would have had varying degrees of experience, varying degrees of comfort with the unknown, and varying degrees of patience with a voyage that was, by the time they reached the Australian coast, probably already running longer than the most optimistic projections. Morale on a small ship in unfamiliar waters is a fragile thing, and the deaths that would come, more on that shortly, would have made it more fragile still. For now, though, in this part of the voyage, the Duyfken was still moving, still making southward progress along a coast that no European chart showed. The crew was doing their work, watching the water, measuring the depth, recording the shape of the coastline, giving Dutch names to the features they passed. A headland here, a river mouth there. The names they gave have not all survived, but the act of naming was itself significant. It was the European way of taking intellectual possession of a place, of making it legible in the language of the chart. The land did not care what names the Duyfken's crew gave it. The people who lived on it had their own names, had had their own names for every river and headland and stretch of mangrove for thousands of years. But the Dutch names went onto the chart, and the chart went back to Bantam. And that is how this stretch of Australian coastline entered the recorded geography of the European world. What Janszoon made of what he was seeing, whether he suspected he had crossed into a new landmass, whether he had any sense that this coast was different in character from the New Guinea coast he had been following, is something we simply cannot know. The man left no diary, no letter, no account of his inner state during the voyage. We have the chart and we have the later references. Everything else is inference. What we can say is that the Duyfken kept moving south, kept following the coast, until the encounters with the people of this land forced a reckoning that no amount of careful navigation could have prepared the crew for. So let us stay with the coast for a moment longer, because the physical reality of this place deserves more attention than it usually gets in the retelling of this story. Most accounts of the Janszoon voyage move quickly through the geography. A sentence or two about Cape York, a mention of the Gulf of Carpentaria, and then on to the events. But the landscape itself is part of what makes this voyage so strange and so human. The crew of the Duyfken did not arrive at a dramatic, recognisable coastline. They did not see towering cliffs or a broad natural harbour or any of the features that tend to make landfall feel like an event. What they found as they moved south along the western edge of Cape York Peninsula was one of the most understated coastlines on Earth. The Pennefather River area, which most historians now accept as the likely location of the first European landfall on Australian soil, sits on the western coast of Cape York at roughly 14 degrees south latitude. If you were to look at it on a map, it is a stretch of coast that offers very little visual drama. The river itself is modest, draining into a wide, shallow estuary that spreads across a mudflat before meeting the sea. The mangroves here are thick and old, their roots reaching down into the grey-brown mud in overlapping arches, forming a kind of living barrier between the water and the land. At low tide, the mudflat extends far out from the river mouth, and the water over it is barely knee-deep in places. At high tide, the flat disappears and the mangroves stand with their lower trunks submerged, the water pressing up to their lower branches. For a ship with the draft of the Duyfken, even a shallow-drafted vessel by the standards of its time, this coastline required constant attention. The soundings would have been taken regularly. A weighted line dropped over the side to measure depth, the result called out and noted. In some places along this coast, the water shoals so gradually that a ship can be well out from shore and still be in water only a few metres deep. The tidal range in the Gulf of Carpentaria is modest compared to some parts of the world, but the combination of shallow water and a soft, silty bottom made grounding a genuine risk. A ship grounded on a mudflat in these waters, far from any port, with a reduced crew and no rescue possible, was not a ship that was going home. The crew would have known this. Every man on a ship like the Duyfken understood what grounding meant in a practical sense. It was not an abstract danger. It was the kind of thing that ended voyages and ended lives, and the fact that the Duyfken managed to navigate roughly 320 kilometres of this coastline without losing the ship to the shallows is itself a testament to the skill of whoever was taking the soundings and whoever was reading the water. 320 kilometres. It is worth pausing on that number for a moment, because it represents the scope of what Janszoon's crew actually accomplished in cartographic terms. From the area around the Pennefather River, the Duyfken tracked south and then southwest, following the curve of the coast as it bends around toward the southern end of what is now the western Cape York Peninsula. The chart they produced, which survives in later copies in the Dutch National Archives, shows this stretch of coast rendered with reasonable accuracy given the tools available. The coastline is not perfect. There are distortions, compressions, places where the scale shifts in ways that suggest the soundings were taken quickly or the observations were made under difficult conditions. But the shape of the coast is recognisable. If you overlay the 1606 chart onto a modern map of the region, the correspondence is there. These men were doing real cartographic work under genuinely difficult conditions, and the result held up. The names they applied to the features they passed are mostly gone now, replaced by English names given by later explorers, or by the Aboriginal names that have gradually been restored to some features in recent decades. A few Dutch names from this period survive elsewhere in Australia. The name Duyfken Point on the western coast of Cape York is one of them, given not by Janszoon himself but by later cartographers commemorating the voyage. But during the voyage itself, the naming would have been a working process, a way of keeping track of position and of marking the chart. A river mouth might be noted by its approximate latitude and a brief description. A headland might be given a name that described its appearance or the circumstances of its sighting. The chart was a working document, not a monument. What the crew almost certainly did not do, at least not at first, was go very far inland. The mangrove coast of western Cape York is not an inviting place to push through on foot. The mangroves themselves are nearly impenetrable from the waterside. The root systems are complex and unstable underfoot. The mud between them is deep and sucking, and the vegetation is dense enough to block sightlines almost immediately. Beyond the mangroves, the land opens up, but getting there from the water required either finding a gap in the mangrove line, usually at a river mouth, or landing on one of the occasional sandy beaches that interrupt the coast. These beaches exist, but they are not common along this stretch. The most practical landing points would have been the river mouths, the Pennyfeather, the Kirk, the Ducie. These rivers open gaps in the mangrove wall and offer access to fresh water, which was always the first priority. A ship's boat could be rowed up a river mouth past the mangrove fringe and into the cleaner water upstream, where the crew could fill their water casks. This was standard practice on any long coastal voyage, and there is no reason to think the Duyfken's crew did not attempt it here. Whether they succeeded without difficulty on the first attempts, or whether the encounters with Aboriginal people began almost immediately, the documents do not clearly say. What they do say in the later references is that the encounters happened, and that they were violent, and that men died. But before the violence, there was presumably a period of observation on both sides. The Duyfken moving slowly along the coast, the crew watching the shore, and from the shore, people watching back. The Aboriginal groups who lived along the western coast of Cape York Peninsula in 1606 are the ancestors of the Wick people and related language groups who still live in that region today. These were and are people with a deep and detailed knowledge of their country, a knowledge accumulated over thousands of years, encoded in language, in ceremony, in the names of every feature of the landscape. The Wick people's connection to Western Cape York extends back to a time that European history cannot easily comprehend. When the Duyfken appeared off their coast, it was not the first strange thing their ancestors had ever seen. There had been contact with Macassan fishermen from the Indonesian archipelago for centuries, possibly longer. Fishermen who came south each year on the northwest monsoon to harvest trepang, or sea cucumber, from the shallow waters of northern Australia. So the sight of a foreign vessel was not in itself without precedent. But the Duyfken was different from a Macassan proa. It was larger, it was made differently, it carried guns. The men aboard it looked different, moved differently, and whatever communication they attempted would have been in languages entirely foreign to the people on shore. The Malay interpreters that the Duyfken may have carried, and this is uncertain, but possible, given that the VOC routinely used Malay as a trade language in this region, would have been of limited use here. The Wick languages bear no relationship to Malay. There was no common ground linguistically, and without language, every interaction was a negotiation conducted entirely through gesture, proximity, and the body language of people who had no shared framework for understanding each other's intentions. This is not a simple thing to think about. It is easy to describe first contact as a collision of worlds, but that phrase flattens what was actually a series of individual moments, each one charged with uncertainty on both sides. A sailor in a small boat rowing toward a riverbank. People on the bank watching him approach, neither side knowing what the other would do, the sailor wanting water, the people on the bank having no way of knowing that. The sailor perhaps holding out his hands, perhaps making sounds intended to seem friendly. The people on the bank reading those sounds and gestures through a framework of meaning that the sailor could not access. And somewhere in that gap between intention and interpretation, something went wrong. The VOC records that survive, particularly the 1618 deposition by Jan Carstens, who was preparing for his own voyage to the region and was drawing on accounts of the Duyfken's experience, state that at least 10 of Janszoon's crew were killed in conflicts with the Aboriginal people along the coast. 10 men, out of a crew of approximately 20. That is half the crew, if the estimate of 20 is accurate, though some historians think the Duyfken may have carried slightly more. Even at a more conservative reading, the losses were catastrophic for a small ship operating far from any support. The deaths did not all happen at once. The references suggest a series of incidents spread across the southern portion of the voyage, as the Duyfken continued to attempt landings and the encounters continued to turn violent. Whether the Aboriginal people were responding to specific provocations, attempts to take food, or to seize people, or to enter sacred areas, or whether they were simply defending their territory against an incomprehensible intrusion, is impossible to say from the surviving records. The VOC documents frame the encounters from the Dutch perspective, using language that reflects the assumptions of the time. The Aboriginal perspective was not recorded by anyone who had access to it, and the oral histories of the Wick people, while they exist and are significant, have not been matched with certainty to specific events of the 1606 voyage. What can be said is that the violence was real, that it cost lives on at least one side, and that it shaped the course of the voyage in a direct and practical way. A crew that has lost a significant portion of its men to shore encounters is a crew that is going to become more cautious about further landings. The Duyfken's ability to continue exploring, to send boats ashore to take on fresh water and food, would have been compromised by the losses. And the further south the ship went, the further it was from any possibility of assistance. The landscape, too, was becoming less hospitable in a different sense. As the Duyfken moved further into the Gulf of Carpentaria, the coast remained flat and low, but the character of the exploration was changing. The crew was moving deeper into waters that no chart described, further from the edge of even the most speculative Portuguese mapping. The Gulf of Carpentaria is a large, shallow, roughly rectangular body of water, about 600 kilometres from north to south, and about 330 kilometres across at its widest. The Duyfken was tracing its eastern shore, the Cape York side moving steadily south. The water in the southern reaches of the Gulf is particularly shallow, and the tidal flats extend far from shore in some areas. For a ship already short-handed and already wary of the coast, this was not encouraging territory. There is something almost melancholy about imagining the voyage at this stage. The initial purpose, find gold, find trade goods, find new commercial opportunities, had clearly not been fulfilled. The coast offered nothing that looked like wealth to a VOC crew. The people they had encountered had been hostile at terrible cost. The ship was short of men, the water ahead was getting shallower, and still the Duyfken pushed on, for a while at least, driven by the logic of the expedition, and by Janszoon's orders, which had told him to explore as far south as possible. The exact point at which he turned back is recorded in later documents as approximately 13 degrees 45 minutes south latitude. This is a specific enough number that historians have been able to place it on the modern map. It corresponds to a location on the western coast of Cape York, still well north of the tip of the peninsula. The Duyfken did not reach the southernmost point of Cape York. It did not get close enough to the Torres Strait to recognise it as a strait, and that fact, the failure to recognise the Torres Strait, would have enormous consequences for how Janszoon and the VOC understood what they had found. Because if you cannot see the gap between New Guinea and Australia, if the shallow, island-dotted waters of the Torres Strait do not resolve themselves into a recognisable channel, then the coast you have been following along Cape York looks, on a chart, like a continuation of the New Guinea coast. The two land masses appear connected, and that is exactly how the chart the Duyfken produced showed it. A coastline running south from New Guinea, bending west, with no indication that a separate continent lay to the south and east. Janszoon, as far as the evidence suggests, believed he had been mapping a southern extension of New Guinea. The idea that he had touched a new continent, a landmass entirely separate, vast, unknown, does not appear to have occurred to him, or at least does not appear in any surviving record. This is one of the genuinely strange things about this voyage. The man who made the first documented European landing on Australian soil did not know he had done so. He came, he mapped, he lost men, he turned back and he filed his report. The continent beneath his feet was, to him, just more coast, just more shallow brown water and mangroves and difficult hostile terrain, just another place that had not yielded what the company was looking for. The Duyfken turned north, retracing its route along the coast it had charted, heading back toward New Guinea and then toward Bantam. The men who had survived were sailing home with a chart, a story of losses and no gold. What they carried, without knowing it, was the first European record of Australia, and that record was about to be filed away, marked as a disappointment and largely forgotten for a very long time, though the consequences of what the Duyfken had found and what it had set in motion would eventually reshape the history of an entire continent. But that part of the story belongs to what happened when the ship returned and the long silence that followed. What happened on that coast, in the weeks the Duyfken spent moving along the western edge of Cape York, is one of the most difficult parts of this story to reconstruct. Not because the events were minor, but because the records that survive are incomplete, second-hand, and written entirely from one perspective. The journal of the voyage itself does not survive in any complete form. What we have instead are references, summaries and depositions made years later by men who were either on the voyage or who had spoken to those who were. And what those documents say, plainly, is that the encounters with the people of this coast were violent, and that the Duyfken lost men. At least 10 members of the crew were killed in clashes with Aboriginal people along the shore. 10 men, out of a crew of around 20. That is not a footnote. That is half the ship's complement, or close to it, lost not to storm or reef or disease, but to conflict on a coast that no European had ever mapped. The number appears in a 1618 document, a deposition given by Jan Carstens, a VOC navigator who would later lead his own expedition to these waters, and who referenced the Duyfken's experience as a warning about what his own crew might face. Carstens described the earlier voyage as having lost men to the inhabitants, and the figure of 10 deaths became part of the institutional memory of the VOC's knowledge of this coast. It shaped how later Dutch expeditions approached the region. It was, in a grim and practical sense, useful information, the kind of information a trading company files away in consults before sending the next ship. But what actually happened during those encounters is something we cannot fully reconstruct. The surviving records describe the deaths, but not the events that led to them in any granular detail. We do not know which part of the coast the worst clashes occurred on. We do not know whether the violence escalated gradually over multiple encounters, or whether a single confrontation produced the majority of the casualties. We do not know the names of the crew members who died, or what exactly they were doing when they were killed. What we can piece together, from the geography and from what is known about how such voyages operated, is the general shape of what was probably happening. The Duyfken needed fresh water. After weeks at sea, any ship needs fresh water, and finding it meant sending men ashore. It also meant approaching the coast in small boats. The ship itself would have anchored some distance out in the shallow water, and a party would have rowed to the beach in a longboat or a smaller craft. These shore parties were vulnerable. They were away from the ship, often in terrain they did not understand, trying to accomplish practical tasks, filling water barrels, looking for food, observing the land, while navigating an encounter with people whose language they did not speak and whose intentions they could not read. The people they were encountering were almost certainly the Wick people, and related groups who have lived on the western Cape York Peninsula for thousands of years. The Wick are among the Aboriginal peoples whose connection to this land is among the longest documented on Earth. Their ancestors have been on Cape York for at least 50,000 years, possibly longer. The land the Duyfken's crew was stumbling through was not empty, not unknown, not unnamed. It was deeply, intricately known. Every waterway, every seasonal resource, every sacred site, every boundary between one group's country and another's. The crew of the Duyfken arrived in the middle of all of that with no understanding of any of it. There were no interpreters. This is worth pausing on for a moment. The VOC was generally quite sophisticated about the use of local interpreters and intermediaries in its Asian operations. In the Banda Islands, in Java, in the Malay ports, there were people who spoke multiple languages, who could mediate between Dutch traders and local populations. The VOC relied on these networks heavily, but on the western coast of Cape York in 1606, there was no such network. The languages spoken by the Wick people and their neighbours were entirely unknown to any European, and entirely unknown to the Malay-speaking intermediaries who might have accompanied the Duyfken from Bantam. The communication gap was absolute. Two groups of people standing on the same beach with no shared word between them. What would that have looked like from the shore? A vessel unlike anything in living memory, or perhaps unlike anything in the memory of any generation appearing on the horizon. A strange, large, dark shape moving through the shallow water, then smaller boats coming toward the beach, carrying men with unfamiliar clothing, unfamiliar tools, unfamiliar faces. There is no way to know how the Wick people interpreted what they were seeing. Some accounts from other parts of the world, where first contact was recorded more carefully, suggest that initial reactions range from curiosity to caution to alarm, and that the progression from one to another could happen very quickly depending on what the arriving strangers did. A group of men who walked calmly and offered objects might be received one way. A group of men who moved toward a water source, or toward a camp, or who attempted to take something, might be received very differently. The Duyfken's crew needed water. They needed food. They were probably tired, and some of them were probably sick, as crews on long voyages almost always were. They were operating under orders to explore and to assess the land for commercial potential, which meant they needed to go ashore, not just observe from the water. And they were doing all of this with no ability to explain themselves, no ability to ask permission, no ability to signal peaceful intent in any way that the people on shore could understand. Whether the violence that followed was provoked by specific actions, attempts to take food or water without consent, attempts to move into areas that were restricted, attempts to seize people for questioning, which was something VOC crews sometimes did in other parts of Asia, or whether it arose from a more general defensive response to an incomprehensible intrusion, is impossible to say with certainty. Both explanations are plausible. Both may have been true at different points along the coast. The VOC records, as noted, frame the events from the Dutch side and use the language of their time, which tends to describe Aboriginal resistance as hostility rather than defence. Reading those accounts carefully, and reading them with an awareness of their limitations, is necessary if you want to get any sense of what might actually have happened. What is clear is that the violence was not one-sided in its effects, even if the surviving record only counts Dutch casualties. The Duyfken's crew had firearms, 8 guns on the ship, and almost certainly personal weapons carried by shore parties. Whether those weapons were used in the encounters, and to what effect, the records do not say directly. It would be surprising if they were not used at all, given the scale of the losses the crew suffered. But there is no document that describes an engagement in enough detail to say what happened. The silence in the record is, in its own way, significant. It suggests that the VOC was not interested in documenting the details of these encounters beyond noting their outcome: the deaths of crew members, the difficulty of the coast, the unsuitability of the region for easy commercial exploitation. The oral histories of the Wick people do exist, and they are significant. The Wick have maintained continuous connection to their country through generations of storytelling, ceremony and cultural practice. But matching specific Wick oral traditions to the specific events of the 1606 voyage is not straightforward. The events of that year are very old, and the oral record, while it preserves deep knowledge of the country and its history, has not been matched with certainty to the Duyfken's visit by historians or by the communities themselves in any documented and verified way. This is not a reason to dismiss the Wick perspective. It is a reason to be careful about claiming to know more than the evidence allows. What can be said is that the people of this coast have their own history of this land, a history that predates the Duyfken by an almost incomprehensible span of time, and that any account of the 1606 voyage that treats the Aboriginal people as simply a background obstacle is getting the story badly wrong. The losses to the crew change the character of the voyage. A ship that sets out with 20 men and loses 10 is a different ship. The mathematics of it are stark. Shore parties become smaller or stop happening. The ability to send boats ahead to sound the depth, to explore inlets, to look for fresh water and food, all of that becomes harder when you have half the people you started with. The crew that continued south into the Gulf of Carpentaria after the worst of the encounters was a diminished crew, moving more cautiously, with less capacity for the kind of active coastal exploration that the voyage's orders had called for. And yet they kept going for a while. The Duyfken pressed further south, tracing the coast into the Gulf, moving into waters that became shallower and more difficult. The landscape did not change in any encouraging way. The mangroves continued, the tidal flats continued, the low, flat horizon continued. There was nothing that looked like gold country, nothing that looked like the kind of settled trading civilization that the VOC was hoping to find. The coast was inhabited, clearly. The violence had demonstrated that, but not in a way that offered any commercial opening. No harbour, no market, no commodity that a VOC crew could recognise as valuable. There is something worth sitting with here. The land the Duyfken was moving along was, in fact, rich. The western Cape York Peninsula and the Gulf of Carpentaria coastline support an enormous diversity of life. Fish, turtles, dugong, birds, plant foods, freshwater sources. The Wick people and their neighbours had developed over thousands of years an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of how to live in and from this landscape. But none of that richness was visible to a VOC crew looking for gold and spices. The framework they were using to evaluate what they were seeing was entirely wrong for the place they had found. They were looking for something that wasn't there, and they couldn't see what was actually there because it didn't fit any category they had for value. This is not a criticism of Janszoon or his crew. It is simply a description of the limits of what any group of people can see when they arrive somewhere with a specific set of expectations and no tools for understanding anything outside them. The Duyfken's crew were experienced sailors and traders. They were capable in their own world of sophisticated judgment, but they were in a place that was entirely outside their world, and they had no map, literal or conceptual, for what they were looking at. The coast was just coast. The people were just people they couldn't talk to. The land was just land that didn't have what they came for. By the time Janszoon made the decision to turn back, the voyage had already been shaped by loss and frustration into something quite different from what it had set out to be. The deaths, the failed encounters, the shallow water, the absence of anything commercially promising, all of it pointed in the same direction. The Duyfken had reached its southern limit, had found nothing it was looking for, and had paid a serious price for the attempt. The practical logic of turning back was overwhelming. What the crew carried north with them, as they retraced the coast they had charted, was a set of observations that would eventually be compiled into a map. That map would show a coastline running south from New Guinea, bending west along what we now call the Gulf of Carpentaria, ending at the point where the Duyfken turned around. It would show Dutch place names attached to features that had Aboriginal names already, names that had been in use for longer than any European civilization had existed. And it would show, crucially, no gap between New Guinea and the coast to the south, because the Duyfken had not found the Torres Strait, and because without that gap the coast it had traced looked like a continuation of land already known rather than the edge of something entirely new. The map was, in a sense, accurate about what the Duyfken had actually seen. It was just missing the piece of information that would have changed everything, the piece that would have told Janszoon and the VOC and eventually the world that this was not more New Guinea. This was something else entirely. That realization would come, but not yet. Not on this voyage. The Duyfken was heading home, and the coast it was leaving behind would wait, as it had always waited, as its people had always known it, for whatever came next. So the Duyfken turned around. That is the simple version of what happened, and like most simple versions, it leaves out almost everything that makes the moment worth thinking about. The decision to reverse course was almost certainly made somewhere around 13 degrees and 45 minutes south latitude, deep into what we now call the Gulf of Carpentaria, along a coastline that had been growing shallower and less navigable for days. The exact moment of the decision is not recorded, because the full journal of the voyage does not survive. What survives is the map, and the map ends. The coastline Janszoon charted simply stops at a certain point, and that stopping point is where the Duyfken ran out of either the will or the capacity to continue, probably both. The reasons were practical, and they stacked up in a way that left very little room for argument. The crew was diminished, 10 men dead, or something close to that number, killed in the encounters along the coast to the north. The ship's complement, never large to begin with, had been reduced to the point where certain operations became genuinely dangerous. Sounding the depth ahead of the ship, which required putting a small boat out in front to measure the water with a lead line, was the kind of task that needed reliable hands. With fewer men, the margins got tighter. A shallow draft vessel like the Duyfken could navigate waters that would have grounded a larger ship. But even the Duyfken had limits, and the Gulf of Carpentaria, with its wide, flat, muddy shallows, was testing those limits steadily. There was also the question of supplies. A voyage of this kind, months out from Bantam working along an unknown coast, consumed food and fresh water at a rate that had to be carefully managed. The stops along the coast that might have replenished those supplies had, in several cases, turned into the violent encounters that cost them their crewmen. If shore parties were now smaller and more cautious, the ability to gather what the ship needed was correspondingly reduced. A crew that is hungry and short of water does not explore well. And then there was the land itself. The Gulf of Carpentaria coast in that area offers very little to a ship looking for the kind of thing the VOC had sent the Duyfken to find. No harbour deep enough to be useful. No visible settlement of the kind that would suggest organised trade. No mountain range in the background that might indicate mineral wealth. The landscape was, and in many places still is, extraordinarily flat, the kind of flat that feels almost geological in its completeness, as if the land has simply decided to offer no vertical relief at all. The mangroves continued, the tidal creeks continued, the brown water, cloudy with sediment, continued. If Janszoon stood at the bow of the Duyfken and looked south, he would have seen more of the same thing he had been looking at for weeks, with no obvious reason to believe it would change. The orders he had been given, to look for gold-bearing lands, to seek trading opportunities, had produced nothing. Whatever was here, it was not what the VOC was looking for, and in the logic of a commercial voyage, a place that offers nothing commercially useful is, in the most direct sense, not worth the cost of continuing to explore it. The men who had died were already a cost that could not be recovered. The only question was whether to add to that cost or to turn around and bring back what information had been gathered. So Janszoon turned around, what he carried back north with him in the form of observations, sketches, compass bearings, depth soundings, and the accumulated memory of the crew, was the raw material for a map. That map, when it was eventually compiled and drawn up properly, would show approximately 320 kilometres of coastline that no European chart had previously recorded. It would name features in Dutch. It would show the shape of the western Cape York coast and the curve of the Gulf, rendered with the kind of careful attention to navigable detail that was the VOC's primary interest in any new coastline. It was, in its way, a significant piece of cartographic work, but the map contained an error, or rather an absence, that would define how the voyage was understood for years afterward. There was no gap between the coast Janszoon had charted and the coast of New Guinea to the north. On the map, the two landmasses appeared to be connected. The Australian coast was shown as a southward extension of New Guinea, a continuation of land that was already, at least vaguely, known to European geography. There was no strait, there was no separation, there was just coast, running south and then west, ending where the Duyfken had ended. This was not a fabrication or a guess. It reflected what the Duyfken had actually encountered. The ship had come south along the New Guinea coast, crossed into the waters north of Cape York, and then followed the Australian coast, without ever clearly identifying the body of water between New Guinea and Australia as a strait rather than a bay or an inlet. The Torres Strait, the narrow reef-filled channel that separates the two land masses, was apparently either missed or seen but not recognised for what it was, or approached from an angle that made it appear to be simply another coastal feature, rather than a passage between two separate bodies of land. It is worth spending a moment on the Torres Strait itself, because understanding why Janszoon missed it, or why he didn't recognise it, requires some sense of what it actually looks like. The strait is not a clean, obvious channel of open water. It is roughly 150 kilometres wide at its narrowest, but it is filled with islands, reefs, shoals and shallow patches that make navigation genuinely difficult. The water is often murky. The currents are complex and can be strong. From certain approaches, particularly from the west or northwest, the islands in the strait can make the passage look more like a continuation of the coast than an opening between two land masses. Even later, navigators who knew the strait existed found it difficult and dangerous. For a crew approaching from the north, following a coast southward, the visual evidence that they were passing the tip of a separate continent, rather than rounding a peninsula of New Guinea, was not necessarily obvious. There is also the question of what Janszoon expected to see. He was working from Portuguese charts that showed New Guinea as a large, vaguely defined landmass extending southward into uncertain territory. The concept of a separate continent to the south, Terra Australis, existed in European geographical thinking, but it was theoretical, a philosophical necessity rather than a documented reality. When Janszoon's coast began to show characteristics that differed from New Guinea, the different vegetation, the different people, the different character of the land, there was no mental framework readily available that would have told him, this is not an extension of what you know. This is something new. The framework he was using said, this is coast. Coast is coast. Follow it until you have to stop. So the map showed New Guinea and Australia as one continuous landmass, and that is what the VOC received when the Duyfken returned to Bantam. The chart, sometimes referred to by historians as the Kaarte van het Land van de Eendracht, though that name more properly belongs to a slightly later document, was filed away as a piece of navigational intelligence. It told future VOC captains something useful. There is coast here, it is shallow and difficult, the people are hostile, there is nothing worth trading for. Stay away or approach carefully. It did not tell them, you have found a new continent. Because Janszoon did not know that, and the VOC looking at the chart had no reason to conclude otherwise. This is one of the stranger aspects of the whole story. The voyage that produced the first documented European landing on the Australian continent, the voyage that put the first European eyes on that coastline, the first European boots in that tidal mud, was understood by the people who made it as a voyage to an extension of New Guinea. The significance of what they had done was invisible to them, not because they were incurious or unintelligent, but because the information that would have made the significance visible, the existence of the Torres Strait as a genuine separation between two land masses, was the one piece of information they had not been able to gather. There is something almost poignant about this, if you sit with it for a moment. Janszoon and his crew had done something that, in retrospect, matters enormously to the history of an entire continent and its subsequent centuries of European engagement. They had crossed a threshold that no European had crossed before. They had stood on ground that would eventually become the subject of colonial possession, settlement, dispossession, nation building, all the enormous and often terrible history that follows from European arrival in a new place. And they had no idea. They thought they were on New Guinea. They thought they had followed a coast to its limit and found nothing useful. They turned around and went home. The discoverer did not know what he had discovered. That is the sentence that keeps coming back when you think about this voyage. It is not a paradox exactly. It is just a description of how knowledge actually works, how it is always incomplete in the moment of acquisition, how the meaning of an event is often only visible from a distance that the people living through it cannot have. Janszoon was inside the voyage. He could not see it from the outside the way we can. He could not know that the coast he was leaving behind was not more New Guinea but the edge of the largest island on Earth, a continent that would one day be called Australia, that would one day have cities and highways and airports and a population of tens of millions, and that all of that would be traced back in part to the moment his small ship moved through brown water near the Pennefather River in early 1606. He just saw coast. He turned around. He went home. The return journey north retraced the coast the Duyfken had already charted, which meant moving back through the waters where the worst of the encounters had happened. This part of the voyage is essentially undocumented. The surviving records give us very little about the northward passage. It is reasonable to assume that the crew was cautious, that they stayed close to the ship where possible, that shore parties were minimal or non-existent. They had learned at significant cost that the coast was inhabited by people who were not willing to allow the Duyfken's crew to move freely on land. The northward journey was probably focused on one thing: getting back to waters they knew, getting back toward New Guinea, getting back toward Bantam. At some point in mid-1606, the exact timing is uncertain, the Duyfken arrived back at Bantam. The voyage was over. The crew that returned was smaller than the crew that had left. The ship had covered thousands of kilometres of ocean and coast, had mapped a stretch of coastline that had never appeared on a European chart, had made contact with Aboriginal Australians in a series of encounters that were violent and fatal on both sides, and had returned with no gold, no spices, no trade agreement, and no prospect of any commercial return. From the VOC's perspective, this was a failed voyage. Not catastrophically failed. The ship came back, the charts came back, the information came back, but failed in the sense that mattered most to a joint stock trading company. It had produced no revenue and no obvious path to future revenue. The coast that Janszoon had mapped was noted as hostile and commercially worthless. The VOC would not rush to send another ship to the same waters, and yet the chart existed. The observations existed. Somewhere in the VOC's administrative apparatus, the record of what the Duyfken had found was filed and preserved. Not celebrated, not published, not shared with the wider world of European geography. The VOC treated its navigational charts as proprietary commercial intelligence, not as contributions to human knowledge, but kept. And that keeping, as it turned out, was enough. The chart would survive. The record would survive. And eventually, long after everyone involved was dead, someone would look at that chart and understand what it actually showed. But that reckoning was still in the future. For now, the Duyfken was back at Bantam. The voyage was over and Janszoon had to account for what he had done and what he had not done. The VOC had questions. The answers were not encouraging. And the story of how the company received that news and what they did or didn't do with the knowledge that had come back aboard that small battered ship is where the voyage's strange afterlife begins. The meeting, when it happened, was probably not dramatic. There was no formal tribunal, no public reckoning. The VOC did not operate that way. It operated through paperwork, through reports filed with the Heren 17, the Council of 17 Directors who governed the company from Amsterdam, through the slow machinery of commercial administration that turned voyages into numbers, observations into assessments, and expeditions into line items on a ledger. Janszoon would have made his report to the VOC officials at Bantam. He would have submitted his chart. He would have explained what had happened, the coast that extended south from New Guinea, the shallow waters, the hostile encounters, the men lost, the absence of anything commercially useful. And the officials at Bantam would have listened and written it down, and drawn the only conclusion that was available to them from the information Janszoon had brought back. The conclusion was not favourable. The VOC was not a philosophical institution. It was not funded by curiosity. Its investors, and it had thousands of them because the VOC was among the first companies in history to issue publicly traded shares, which it had done in 1602, had put their money in expecting a return. The spice trade was the engine of that return. Nutmeg from the Banda Islands, cloves from Maluku, pepper from Bantam. These were the commodities that made the whole enterprise worthwhile, that justified the ships and the men, and the violence and the enormous logistical complexity of maintaining a trading empire 10,000 kilometres from home. Everything the VOC did was evaluated against that standard. Did it produce revenue? Did it open a path to revenue? Did it at least provide information that might eventually lead to revenue? The Duyfken's voyage failed all three tests. The coast Janszoon had mapped produced no gold, no spices, no valuable goods of any kind. The people who lived there were, from the VOC's perspective, not potential trading partners. The violent encounters had made that clear enough. The waters were shallow and difficult. The land was flat and unpromising. There was no obvious reason to go back. And so the VOC did what large commercial organisations do with information that doesn't serve their immediate interests. They filed it. They kept the chart. They noted the voyage in their records. And they moved on. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is so different from how we tend to imagine the great discoveries of the age of exploration. We have inherited a narrative in which discovery is followed by recognition, recognition by celebration, celebration by fame. Columbus returning to Spain, Vasco da Gama arriving back in Lisbon, the explorer greeted by royalty, the maps published, the accounts printed and distributed across Europe, the discoverer's name attached to what he found and carried forward into history. That is the narrative. It is not entirely false. Those things did happen in some cases, but it is not the whole picture, and the Duyfken's voyage is a good example of what the picture looks like when the narrative breaks down. There was no royal audience for Janszoon. There was no published account. There was no celebration. The VOC did not want its navigational charts published. That information was valuable precisely because it was not shared with competitors. The Portuguese and the Spanish and the English were all operating in the same waters, all looking for the same advantages, and the VOC's charts were one of its most carefully guarded assets. Publishing the Duyfken's findings would have been, from the company's perspective, a form of commercial self-harm, so the chart stayed in the archive, the voyage stayed in the records, and the wider world of European geography, the mapmakers and scholars and curious readers who were consuming accounts of exploration with enormous appetite in the early 17th century, knew nothing about what the Duyfken had found. Janszoon himself received no particular recognition. His name does not appear in the popular literature of the period. He was not celebrated in pamphlets or commemorated in paintings. He was a VOC employee who had completed an assignment, and the assignment had not gone well, and that was more or less the end of it as far as the company was concerned. He continued to serve the VOC. His career did not end here, and we will come back to what happened to him in the years that followed. But the voyage of 1605 to 1606 did not define him in his own lifetime. It did not make him famous. It did not even make him particularly notable within the VOC's own administrative hierarchy. He was one of many skippers, one of many commanders, one of many men who spent their working lives moving between the islands and ports of the Dutch East Indies in the service of a company that was, by the early 17th century, one of the most powerful commercial entities on Earth. There is something quietly strange about this. The man who made the first documented European landing on the continent of Australia was, in his own time, essentially anonymous. The voyage that would eventually be recognised as one of the most significant moments in the history of European exploration was treated at the time it happened as a minor commercial failure. The chart that documented a coastline no European had ever recorded was stored in an archive and not looked at again with serious attention for nearly 3 centuries. The gap between the historical significance of the event and the contemporary response to it is almost vertiginous when you think about it directly. But perhaps it should not be surprising. The people at Bantam in 1606 did not know they were living in what would later be called the Age of Exploration, with all the retrospective grandeur that phrase implies. They were living in the age of the spice trade, which was a much more specific and commercially pressured thing. They were not trying to fill in the map of the world for the sake of human knowledge. They were trying to find new sources of profit and new routes to existing sources of profit. When a voyage came back without either, it was a disappointment, full stop. The historical significance of having found a new continent was not a category that existed in their thinking, partly because they did not know they had found a new continent, and partly because even if they had known, it would not have been immediately clear what commercial use that knowledge was. The VOC's indifference to the voyage is, in a way, the most honest possible response to it. It tells you what the voyage actually was, stripped of the retrospective meaning we have layered onto it. It was a small ship sent to look for gold and trade opportunities. It came back with neither. The men who sent it were disappointed. The man who commanded it moved on to other assignments. That is the reality of the voyage as it was lived, as opposed to the reality of the voyage as it has been remembered. And yet the record survived. This is the thing that keeps coming back. The VOC was, whatever its failings, an extraordinarily thorough record-keeping institution. It generated an almost incomprehensible volume of paperwork, logs, charts, correspondence, contracts, inventories, depositions, reports, and it kept most of it. The VOC archive, which eventually made its way to the Dutch National Archives in The Hague, is one of the largest collections of early modern commercial records in existence. It runs to something like 25 million pages, and somewhere in those 25 million pages the Duyfken's voyage was preserved. Not highlighted, not flagged as important, not given any particular prominence, just preserved the way everything was preserved in the ordinary course of institutional record keeping. The chart that Janszoon produced, or that was produced based on his observations, since the exact authorship of VOC charts is often unclear, showed the coast of what is now western Cape York Peninsula attached to the southern coast of New Guinea. It labelled the region, or at least part of it. It showed the track of the Duyfken along approximately 320 kilometres of coastline. It was, in the context of what was known at the time, an entirely reasonable representation of what the crew had observed. They had followed a coast south. The coast had continued. They had not found a strait separating it from New Guinea because the strait, the Torres Strait, was narrow enough, and the approaches complicated enough that the Duyfken had apparently passed through or near it without recognising it as a genuine separation. So on the chart, New Guinea and the Australian coast were one continuous landmass. This was wrong, but it was wrong in a way that was understandable given the information available. Later Dutch voyages would begin to correct this picture. The Pera and Arnhem expedition of 1623, commanded by Jan Carstens, would sail along the same general coast and add considerably more detail. Carstens's journal, which does survive, references the Duyfken's earlier voyage explicitly, noting that the crew of the Pera and Arnhem found evidence of the earlier visit, and that the hostility of the local people was consistent with what Janszoon had reported. By the time of the Carstens voyage, the VOC had a slightly better understanding of what the southern coast actually was, though the full picture of Australia as a separate continent would take considerably longer to emerge. Abel Tasman's voyages of 1642 and 1644 would eventually establish the broad outlines of the continent, though Tasman himself never saw the eastern coast. That would wait for James Cook in 1770. But all of that is downstream from the Duyfken. All of it builds on, or at least runs parallel to, the initial fact that Janszoon had put the first European eyes on that coast and the first European marks on a chart of it. Back at Bantam in 1606, none of that future was visible. The Duyfken was reassigned. Janszoon was given new orders. The VOC's attention moved to other things. There were always other things, always other voyages to plan, other disputes to manage, other competitors to outmaneuver. The Banda Islands were a constant preoccupation. The Portuguese were a constant irritant. The English East India Company, founded in 1600, just 2 years before the VOC, was increasingly active in the same waters and increasingly a source of tension. The VOC had a great deal on its mind in 1606, and the Duyfken's voyage to a hostile, commercially worthless coast was not among its primary concerns. There is a kind of melancholy in this, if you're inclined to feel it. 10 men had died on that coast. They had died in encounters that were, from the perspective of the Aboriginal people they met, probably acts of self-defence. Strangers arriving in boats, attempting to come ashore, refusing to leave. From the perspective of the VOC crew, they had been attacked by people they could not communicate with and did not understand. Either way, they were dead. Their names, for the most part, are not recorded. They appear in the casualty count, 10 men lost, and then they disappear from the record. They are not commemorated anywhere. They are not memorialised. They are just a number in a log entry, a subtraction from the crew manifest, a small piece of the cost of a voyage that the company had already written off as a failure. Janszoon himself, as we have said, continued. He had a career ahead of him, and it was not an undistinguished one. He would go on to command larger vessels, to participate in significant VOC operations, to be present at some of the more consequential moments of the company's early history in the East Indies. But the voyage of 1605 to 1606 would not be the thing that defined him, even within the VOC's own institutional memory. It was a footnote, a minor expedition, a data point in the company's ongoing effort to map the waters of the East Indies and find new sources of profit. The data point was filed, the chart was stored, the Duyfken sailed onto other waters, and the coast that Janszoon had mapped, the low, mangrove-edged tidal coast of western Cape York Peninsula, went back to being what it had always been, a place where people lived, where they had lived for tens of thousands of years, where they would continue to live, largely undisturbed by European attention, for some decades more. The Wick people and their neighbours along that coast would not see another European ship for a generation. The encounter with the Duyfken would have left its mark. Stories, probably, passed down about the strange vessel and the strangers who had come ashore. But the immediate consequence of the visit was simply that the visitors left and did not return. For the VOC, the chapter was closed. For Janszoon, the chapter was closed. For the coast itself, the chapter was closed. But the chart existed. The record existed. And history, which moves at its own pace and pays no attention to the timelines of trading companies, was not finished with the Duyfken's voyage yet. The question of what Janszoon had actually found, and whether he had truly been the first, and what that precedence meant in a world full of competing claims and incomplete records, was a question that would eventually demand a much more careful answer. And answering it would require looking not just at the Duyfken's voyage, but at everything that had happened in those same waters in the same years, including the voyage of a Spanish navigator named Luis Valles de Torres, who had sailed through the strait that now bears his name in the same year that Janszoon was mapping the coast to the south. Luis Valles de Torres is one of those figures who hovers at the edge of the Duyfken story, close enough to complicate it, just far enough away to leave the central question unresolved. He was a Spanish navigator sailing under the command of Pedro Fernández de Quiros on an expedition that had left Callao in Peru in December 1605, roughly the same months that Janszoon was moving south from Bantam. Quiros was on a mission of a very different character from Janszoon's. Where Janszoon was a company man looking for trade goods and gold, Quiros was a visionary, a devout Catholic who believed he was destined to find and claim the great southern continent for Spain and for the faith. He had spent years lobbying the Spanish crown for this expedition. He believed, genuinely and deeply, that Terra Australis Incognita was real, that it was vast, and that converting its people to Christianity was a sacred obligation. He named the island he found in what is now Vanuatu, Australia del Espiritu Santo, Australia of the Holy Spirit, convinced, at least for a time, that he had found the edge of the great continent. He had not. But he believed it, and that belief was enough to drive the expedition forward until the practical realities of the voyage, illness, crew discontent, dwindling supplies, forced a crisis. The two ships of the expedition, the San Pedro y San Pablo and the Los Tres Reyes, became separated in May 1606, somewhere in the waters north of the New Hebrides. Quiros, on the San Pedro y San Pablo, turned back toward Mexico. Whether this was his choice or his crew's is a matter of historical dispute that was argued about for centuries afterward. Torres, commanding the Los Tres Reyes, did not turn back. He continued west, following the coast of New Guinea, and in doing so he sailed through the strait between New Guinea and the Australian continent that now carries his name, the Torres Strait. He passed through it sometime in the middle months of 1606, which means he was in those waters at roughly the same time the Duyfken was completing its own coastal survey to the south. What Torres actually saw from the Torres Strait is the question that matters. The strait is not a clean, open channel. It is shallow, reef-studded and complicated, scattered with islands and sandbars that make navigation difficult and visibility of the broader coastline uncertain. Torres's own account of the passage, a letter he wrote to the King of Spain from Manila in 1607, describes the strait and its islands in some detail, but does not make a specific claim to have sighted the Australian mainland. He writes of a great land to the south, but the language is ambiguous enough that historians have argued about it ever since. Some read it as a clear reference to having seen the Cape York Peninsula coast. Others read it as a general observation about the geography, consistent with having seen only the islands of the strait itself. The distinction matters because there is a significant difference between sailing through a strait and seeing its southern shore, and actually landing on, or even clearly identifying, a continental coastline. Torres did not land on the Australian coast, he did not map it. He did not name any feature of it. If he saw it at all, he saw it as a low line on the southern horizon from within a reef-filled channel, and he kept moving west. His letter was not published during his lifetime. In fact, it was not widely known in Europe until 1762, when the British captured Manila during the 7 Years' War and found the letter in the Spanish colonial archives. Alexander Dalrymple, a Scottish geographer, published it and argued strenuously that Torres had discovered Australia. The strait was named in Torres's honour at around this time, which is why we call it the Torres Strait today rather than by any Dutch name. But the documentary record for Torres's sighting of the Australian mainland is thin. It rests primarily on that one letter, written a year after the voyage, in a context where Torres had every reason to emphasise the significance of what he had seen. Janszoon, by contrast, produced a chart, an actual map showing an actual coastline, with actual Dutch place names marked along it. The chart was not published, and it did not circulate widely, but it existed as a physical artefact of the voyage, evidence that the Duyfken's crew had not just glimpsed something from a distance, but had sailed along it, measured it, and recorded it. That is a different kind of claim. It is a documented, mapped coastal survey, and it is this difference between possible sighting and documented mapping that leads most historians today to give Janszoon the precedence. The Portuguese question is a separate matter, and in some ways a more intriguing one, because it reaches further back in time and involves evidence that is genuinely puzzling without being conclusive. In the 1540s, a series of maps were produced in Dieppe, in northern France, by French cartographers who had access to Portuguese navigational information. These maps, made by figures like Pierre de Sellier and Guillaume Le Testu, show a large southern landmass that some historians have argued represents Australia. The landmass is labelled Java Grande, and it appears south of Java and east of Africa, in roughly the right part of the world. Its coastline in some of these maps has a shape that bears a passing resemblance to the eastern coast of Australia, and some researchers have argued that the similarity is too close to be coincidental. The argument in its most developed form goes something like this. Portuguese navigators sailing east from the Spice Islands in the early 16th century may have encountered the Australian coast, possibly the northern or northwestern coast, and brought back enough information for it to be incorporated into Portuguese charts. Those charts were then accessed by the French cartographers at Dieppe, who included the information in their own maps under the name Havre Grande. The Portuguese, for reasons of commercial secrecy, never published or officially acknowledged the discovery. It is a genuinely interesting argument. The Dieppe maps are real. Java Grande is real. The resemblance to Australian coastlines, in certain projections and orientations, is real enough to have convinced serious historians. Kenneth McIntyre, an Australian researcher, spent much of his career in the 1970s and 1980s developing this case, and his 1977 book, The Secret Discovery of Australia, argued it at length. But the argument has significant problems. The most basic is that no Portuguese document, no ship's log, no letter, no official records a landing on, or even a clear sighting of the Australian coast before Janszoon. The VOC, which was intensely interested in what the Portuguese knew about these waters, would have been aware of any Portuguese discovery. The silence in the Portuguese records is not proof that no voyage happened, but it is a substantial absence. And the resemblance between Java Grande and Australia on closer examination is imprecise enough that it could also represent a distorted or imagined coastline based on incomplete information about Java and New Guinea, rather than a genuine survey of Australia. Then there is the mahogany ship. This is a legend rather than a documented claim, but it belongs to this general conversation about early arrivals. The story is that a wrecked wooden vessel, apparently of very old construction and made of dark hardwood, was seen on the beach near Warrnambool in Victoria, on the southern coast of Australia, by various witnesses in the 19th century. It was seen repeatedly between about 1836 and the 1880s, then covered by shifting sand dunes and never found again. Some accounts described it as having a distinctly non-English construction, and the theory emerged that it might be a Portuguese caravel from the early 16th century, wrecked on the southern coast and representing evidence of a pre-Janszoon Portuguese voyage. The mahogany ship has been searched for many times. It has never been found. Without the physical evidence, the legend remains exactly that, a legend. It is possible that the vessel existed and was what some witnesses described. It is also possible that it was something else entirely, or that the descriptions became more dramatic with retelling. There is no way to know. What all of this adds up to is a picture of genuine historical uncertainty around the edges of Janszoon's claim. Not uncertainty about whether Janszoon reached Australia, that part is well documented. The chart exists, the VOC records exist, the later references by Carstens exist. But uncertainty about whether he was truly the first European to see the continent, in any form, from any angle, under any circumstances. It is possible that Portuguese navigators saw the northwestern coast in the early 16th century and never wrote it down in a surviving record. It is possible that Torres saw the southern shore of Cape York from within the strait in 1606. It is possible that some other voyage, entirely undocumented, touched the coast at some point in the century and a half between Magellan's circumnavigation and Janszoon's survey. History cannot rule these possibilities out. What it can do is assess the quality of the evidence for each claim, and by that measure, Janszoon's voyage stands alone. It is the only pre-Cook European contact with the Australian coast that is supported by a surviving chart, by multiple independent documentary references, and by a coherent narrative of a deliberate coastal survey. Every other claim is either documented but ambiguous, like Torres, or intriguing but unproven, like the Portuguese theory, or legendary and unverifiable, like the mahogany ship. This is why the Australian government, in its official historical position, and most academic historians of the period, give Janszoon the precedence. Not because the question is simple, but because the evidence is clearest. There is something worth sitting with here, though, which is the strangeness of the word first in this context. First European to reach Australia. Already that phrase contains a choice. It contains the decision to measure arrival by European standards, to count the landfall as significant because Europeans recorded it, to treat the continent as having been discovered in the moment when someone from a distant culture encountered it and wrote it down. The Aboriginal Australians who watched the Duyfken from the shore of Cape York Peninsula in 1606 were not discovering anything. They were watching strangers arrive on a coast they had known for 65,000 years or more. Their ancestors had reached Australia from Southeast Asia during the Pleistocene, crossing water when sea levels were lower, establishing themselves across the continent over thousands of generations. They had named every river, every headland, every seasonal water source. They had detailed knowledge of the ecology, the weather patterns, the tidal rhythms of the coast the Duyfken was carefully surveying. The concept of first depends entirely on whose perspective you are measuring from. From a European perspective, Janszoon's voyage was the opening of a new chapter, the beginning of a process that would eventually lead to British colonisation, to the transformation of the continent, to the profound and ongoing disruption of Aboriginal life and culture. From an Aboriginal perspective, the Duyfken's arrival was not a discovery. It was an intrusion. A strange and troubling event, certainly. The violence of the encounters suggests it was experienced as threatening, but not a beginning. The land had a beginning, and it was tens of thousands of years earlier. Historians have become more careful about this over the past few decades, and rightly so. The framing of discovery as something that happens when Europeans arrive is a colonial framework, and recognising it as such does not erase the historical significance of Janszoon's voyage, but does ask us to hold it alongside a different and older significance. The Duyfken's chart is a document of European expansion. The coast it charts is also a document of human habitation, going back to a depth that makes the VOC look like a very recent footnote. Both things are true, they do not cancel each other out. What makes Janszoon's voyage genuinely interesting in this broader context is precisely its smallness and its incompleteness. It was not a conquest, it was not a settlement. It was not even a successful reconnaissance by the VOC's own standards. It was a small ship crewed by men who were frightened and confused, mapping a coast they did not understand, losing 10 of their number to encounters they could not explain, and eventually turning back without having found anything they were looking for. The continent they had touched was not recognised as a continent. The people they had met were not understood as the inhabitants of a vast and ancient civilization. The chart they produced showed the coast connected to the wrong landmass. In almost every measurable way, the voyage failed to achieve what it set out to achieve. And yet it happened. The Duyfken was there, Janszoon was there, the crew was there, and the record of their presence, however incomplete and however filed away in a company archive without fanfare, survived. That survival, the persistence of the chart, the mention in Carstensen's journal, the entry in the VOC's administrative records, is what allows us to sit here now and say with a reasonable confidence that in early 1606 a Dutch ship sailed along the western coast of Cape York Peninsula, and that this was, as far as the documentary evidence allows us to determine, the first time a European vessel had done so. Torres's voyage complicates this, as we have seen. The Portuguese theory complicates it further, but complication is not the same as refutation. And when you look at the full picture of what is known and what is speculated and what is simply lost to time, Janszoon's claim holds. Imperfectly, as all historical claims do. With caveats, as all claims about the distant past require, but it holds. The question of what happened to Janszoon himself after all of this, after the voyage, after the return to Bantam, after the VOC filed the chart and moved on, is a question that takes us into a different kind of uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of competing claims and disputed evidence, but the quieter uncertainty of a man who kept working, kept serving, kept appearing in company records and then, at some point, simply stopped appearing. His later career is documented well enough to trace its broad outlines, but it ends, as it began, in a kind of historical shadow. The man who found Australia without knowing he had found it eventually disappeared from the record the way he had always lived in it, present in the ledgers, absent from the stories. So let us follow him a little further, past 1606, past the return to Bantam, past the moment when the VOC logged the voyage and moved on to other concerns, because Willem Janszoon did not disappear after the Duyfken came home. He kept working, he kept sailing, he kept appearing in the records of the company that employed him, accumulating years and assignments and the quiet weight of a professional life that continued long after the thing that would eventually make him famous had already happened and been mostly forgotten. The VOC was not a sentimental employer. It measured its people by their usefulness, and Janszoon, whatever his private feelings about the voyage south, remained useful. In the years following 1606, he continued to serve in the waters around the Indonesian archipelago. The vast and complicated region, the Dutch, were steadily consolidating into a commercial empire. He held positions of increasing responsibility, which suggests the company thought reasonably well of him, even if the Duyfken's mission had not produced the results anyone had hoped for. A man who loses 10 crew members and returns without gold or spices is not necessarily a failure in the eyes of a large organisation. He is simply a man who went out, encountered difficult conditions and came back with information. The information, in this case, was a chart. And even if no one quite knew what to do with that chart at the time, the chart existed. By 1616, Janszoon had risen to the rank of commander, which within the VOC's structure was a significant position. He was placed in command of a fleet, not a single small pinnace now, but a group of ships operating in the Maluku region, the Spice Islands themselves, the heart of everything the VOC had been built to exploit. The Nutmeg Islands, the Clove Islands, the places whose names had driven European ambition for more than a century. Janszoon was there, in the middle of it, doing the company's work. And the company's work, by this point, had taken on a harder edge. The early years of Dutch expansion in the region had involved negotiation, alliance building and trade. By the second decade of the 17th century, the VOC had grown more aggressive, more willing to use violence to secure its monopolies, more determined to eliminate competition, not just from the Portuguese and the Spanish, but from the local populations who'd been trading in spices for generations before any European ship appeared on the horizon. The man who had become most associated with this darker phase of the VOC history was Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, who became Governor-General in 1618, and whose approach to the spice trade was, to put it gently, not gentle. Janszoon was present during some of this period. He was involved in VOC operations in the Banda Islands, the small group of islands southeast of Ceram that were the world's only source of nutmeg at the time. The Banda Islands had a population of around 15,000 people when the Dutch arrived. By the time Cohen was finished consolidating VOC control, that population had been reduced by war, famine, disease, and enslavement to something closer to a few hundred. It was one of the most complete demographic catastrophes of the early colonial era, and it happened in a very short span of years, roughly between 1609 and 1621. Where exactly Janszoon stood in relation to these events is difficult to say with precision. He appears in the records. He was present in the region. He commanded ships and participated in VOC operations, but the surviving documents do not give us the kind of detail that would allow a clear moral accounting of his role. He was a company man, serving a company that did terrible things in the pursuit of profit, and that is about as specific as the evidence allows us to be. It is worth noting, simply because it adds texture to the picture of who he was and what world he moved through. The man who made the first documented European landing on Australia was also a participant in one of the most violent episodes of early colonial history in Southeast Asia. These facts coexist in the record without resolving neatly into a simple portrait. There is one other moment in Janszoon's later career that deserves a little attention. In 1616, the same year he was commanding fleets in the Maluku region, he was involved in events around Banda Nera, the largest of the Banda Islands. The VOC was in the process of building a fort there, Fort Nassau, and asserting its control over the nutmeg trade with a combination of military force and economic pressure. Janszoon was part of the VOC presence during this period. His name appears in connection with the operations, though again, the level of detail in the surviving records is frustratingly thin. What we know is that he was there, he was active, and he was a figure of some authority within the company's regional operations. After the Banda period, the record of his movements becomes somewhat harder to follow. He continued to serve, continued to appear in company documents, and at some point in the early 1620s, the exact year is not certain, he returned to the Netherlands. This was not unusual. VOC employees who survived their years in the Indies often came home eventually, sometimes wealthy, sometimes sick, sometimes both. The tropics were genuinely dangerous. Malaria, dysentery, and a dozen other illnesses killed enormous numbers of VOC personnel every year. The men who made it back to the Netherlands after a decade or more in the region were, in a statistical sense, the lucky ones. Janszoon made it back. And then, as far as the historical record is concerned, he more or less vanishes. There is no confirmed date of death. There is no burial record that has been definitively linked to him. There is no portrait, not a single image that can be reliably identified as Willem Janszoon, the man who commanded the Duyfken, the man who sailed along the coast of Cape York Peninsula in 1606 and produced the first European chart of Australian soil. He left no memoir, no published account of his voyages, no personal letters that survive. The rich inner life that a biographer might hope to find, the thoughts about the strange flat coast, the feelings about the men who died, the reflections on a career spent in the service of a company that was reshaping the world. None of that made it through the centuries. What made it through were the ledgers, the ship manifests, the administrative records of an organisation that was very good at tracking cargo and not particularly interested in tracking the inner lives of its employees. This is, in a way, completely consistent with who Janszoon was throughout his documented life. He was always more visible in the records than in the story. You can find his name in the VOC archives. You can trace the broad outlines of his career. But the man himself, his voice, his face, his sense of what he had done and what it meant, is simply not there. He was not the kind of figure who wrote things down for posterity. He was not celebrated in his own time in a way that would have generated the secondary literature, the portraits, the published tributes that allow us to reconstruct a personality across the centuries. He was a skilled maritime professional working for a large corporation, and when he stopped being useful to that corporation, or when he died, the corporation moved on without leaving much of a record of the transition. There is something quietly strange about this, when you think about it in the context of what the voyage actually was. In the centuries since 1606, the Duyfken's journey has been recognised as one of the most significant events in the European history of the Pacific, the first documented contact with the Australian continent, the opening of a geographic chapter that would eventually lead to Cook's voyages, to British colonisation, to the entire modern history of Australia as a nation. It is, by any reasonable measure, a historically consequential moment, and the man at the centre of it spent his remaining years after 1606 as a moderately senior employee of a trading company, participated in some of the more brutal episodes of early Dutch colonialism, returned home to the Netherlands at some point in his 50s or 60s, and then disappeared from the record without ceremony. No one wrote an account of his life. No one commissioned a painting. No one, as far as we know, gathered around a table in Amsterdam and said, that man, that Willem Janszoon, he was the one who first mapped the coast of the great southern continent. If they had known, if the significance of the voyage had been understood at the time, perhaps things would have been different. But they did not know. The VOC did not know it had found a continent. Janszoon did not know. The chart he produced showed the coast of Cape York connected to New Guinea, which meant that in the company's understanding, the Duyfken had simply extended the known coastline of a landmass that was already on the map. There was no great southern continent to celebrate. There was just a coast that had been surveyed, a voyage that had failed to find gold, and 10 men who had not come home. What is particularly interesting in a quiet kind of way is that Janszoon's obscurity was not unusual for his time and profession. The age of exploration produced a handful of names that became famous: Columbus, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, and an enormous number of names that did not. The men who actually did the sailing, the mapping, the careful dangerous work of moving through unknown waters and recording what they found were often employees rather than patrons, skilled workers rather than aristocrats, people whose names ended up in company records rather than in history books. Janszoon was one of these. He was good at his job. He was trusted with difficult assignments. He rose through the ranks of a demanding organisation. And the thing that would eventually make him historically significant, the voyage to Cape York, was, from his employer's perspective, a minor footnote to a career that continued for another 15 years or more after it happened. The silence around his name in his own era is, in a way, a kind of evidence. It tells us something about how the VOC understood the voyage, and how the broader European world understood the geography of the Southern Hemisphere in the early 17th century. If anyone had grasped that the Duyfken had found a new continent, a landmass separate from New Guinea, vast and previously uncharted, there would have been more noise, there would have been more interest. The silence is the sound of a discovery that was not recognised as a discovery, logged by a company that was more interested in nutmeg than in continents, and set aside in an archive where it would wait for nearly 300 years before anyone came looking for it. And yet, sitting here now, knowing what the voyage actually was, there is something worth pausing over in the image of Janszoon returning to the Netherlands in the early 1620s. An older man, probably tired, carrying whatever the tropics had done to his body over the years. Walking through the streets of Amsterdam or wherever it was he settled, past the canal houses and the merchant offices and the busy commercial life of a city that was, in those years, one of the most prosperous in the world. Passing people who had no idea that the man walking among them had done something that, in a different telling of history, would have made him famous. He had no idea either, probably. He had been to many places. He had done many things. The voyage south, the flat coast, the shallow brown water, the men who died. It was part of a long career, not the defining moment of a life. That is the particular texture of his obscurity. It was not tragic exactly. It was not a story of a man who was cheated of recognition, who tried to claim credit and was denied. It was simply the story of a man who did something historically significant without knowing it was historically significant, in the service of an organisation that agreed with him on that point, and who then continued his life in the ordinary way of a competent professional until, at some unknown date, he stopped. The Duyfken itself outlasted him, at least in the records. The little ship continued to sail after the 1606 voyage, appearing in various VOC documents through the early 1620s, until it too disappears from the record, presumably worn out, broken up, or lost at sea somewhere in those busy and dangerous waters. Both the ship and the man who commanded it on its most famous journey faded out of the documentary record at roughly the same time, without fanfare, without a recorded ending. What survived was the chart, and the chart, as it turned out, was enough. It was enough to let later historians reconstruct the voyage, trace the route, confirm the landfall, and eventually placed Janszoon's name at the beginning of a very long story about Australia and the European world. The chart survived because the VOC was good at keeping documents, even documents it did not fully understand. And that survival, that bureaucratic accident of good record keeping, is what connects the man who walked through Amsterdam in the 1620s, unremarked and unremarkable, to the question of how Australia entered the European imagination and what that entry eventually set in motion. It is a strange kind of legacy, not the kind that comes with monuments and anniversaries and school textbooks in your own lifetime. The kind that comes much later, quietly, when someone in a Dutch archive opens a folder and finds a chart that nobody has looked at carefully in 2 centuries and begins to understand what it shows. That process of rediscovery, the slow, careful, archival work of piecing the voyage back together from the documents that survived, is its own kind of story. And it is a story that begins not in 1606 but much later, in the 19th century, when historians started asking seriously what the Dutch had actually known about the Australian coast and when they had known it. That process of rediscovery began, in a meaningful way, with a Dutch scholar named Jan Ernst Heres. Heres was a historian working in the late 19th century, and he had spent considerable time working through the archives of the Dutch East India Company, the enormous, carefully preserved collection of records that the VOC had accumulated over nearly 2 centuries of operation before it was dissolved in 1799. The VOC's archives were, and still are, one of the great documentary collections in the world. Millions of pages. Ship logs, cargo manifests, correspondence between governors and directors, charts, depositions, legal records, crew lists, a vast paper memory of a commercial empire. And somewhere inside that collection, if you knew what to look for, was the documentary skeleton of the Duyfken's voyage south. Heres published his findings in 1899 in a work titled The Part Borne by the Dutch in the Discovery of Australia. It was a careful, scholarly piece of work, not a popular history, not a dramatic retelling, but a systematic effort to gather every surviving document that touched on Dutch knowledge of the Australian coast and lay it out in order. He worked through the VOC records held in the Netherlands, cross-referenced them with charts held in various European collections, and produced what was, for its time, the most thorough account of early Dutch contact with Australia that had ever been assembled. The 1606 voyage of the Duyfken was at the centre of it. What Heres found was fragmentary, but it was enough. The full journal of the voyage did not survive. If it was ever compiled into a single document, it is gone now. What survived were references. A 1618 deposition by the explorer Jan Carstens, who had sailed similar waters, mentioned the Duyfken's earlier voyage and the deaths of crew members in conflicts with the local people. VOC correspondence from Bantam mentioned the ship's return and the disappointing results, and there was the chart. The chart that the Duyfken's voyage produced, sometimes referred to in the literature as the Kaart van het Land van de Eendracht. Though the naming is complicated and that title is sometimes associated with a slightly later document, showed a coastline along the western side of Cape York Peninsula, labelled in Dutch, connected in the chart's geography to the southern coast of New Guinea. It was not a perfect chart. The latitudes were not always accurate, the coastline was simplified, and the connection to New Guinea was a significant geographic error. But it was unmistakably a record of a real coastline, surveyed by people who had been there, with Dutch place names applied to real features that could be matched, with some effort, to the actual geography of the Gulf of Carpentaria region. Heres' work gave historians a framework. It placed the Duyfken's voyage in the documentary record in a way that could be examined, questioned, and built upon. Over the following decades, other scholars came back to the same archives with better tools, better knowledge of the region's geography, and a clearer sense of what to look for. The Dutch National Archives, the National Archive in The Hague, became an important site of this ongoing research. The VOC collection there is vast, and working through it requires patience and a reading knowledge of 17th century Dutch, which is not quite the same as modern Dutch. But the documents are there, and they have continued to yield information. The question of exactly where the Duyfken made landfall has been one of the more productive areas of this research. Historians and geographers have spent considerable effort trying to match the features on the Duyfken's chart to actual places on the Cape York Peninsula. The Pennefather River area, on the western coast of Cape York, has long been the most widely accepted candidate for the first landfall. The place where the crew of the Duyfken first set foot on what is now Australian soil. The geography matches reasonably well. The river mouth, the tidal flats, the shallow water offshore, all of it fits the kind of coast that the chart depicts. It is not a certainty, and some researchers have proposed slightly different locations, but the Pennefather River area has the strongest support in the current literature. This kind of careful, incremental archival work is not the stuff of dramatic television. It is slow. It involves reading documents that are partially damaged, partially illegible, written in an old hand in a language that has changed significantly over 4 centuries. It involves comparing charts that were drawn without the benefit of GPS or accurate longitude measurement, and trying to figure out what real place a particular squiggle on a piece of vellum was meant to represent. But it is the work that makes history possible, and in the case of the Duyfken, it is the work that eventually gave the voyage back to the world. By the late 20th century, there was enough scholarly consensus around the Duyfken's voyage that the question of commemoration began to come up. Australia was approaching the 400th anniversary of European contact, and there was interest in marking that anniversary in a meaningful way. What emerged, over a period of years of planning and fundraising and practical problem solving, was one of the more remarkable maritime heritage projects of the era, the construction of a full-scale working replica of the Duyfken itself. The Duyfken replica was built in Fremantle, Western Australia, and launched in 1999. The project was driven by the Duyfken 1606 Replica Foundation, a group of people who were genuinely committed to building not just a model or a display piece, but an actual sailing vessel that could go to sea. The replica is approximately 20 metres long, which matches the estimated dimensions of the original. It was built using period-appropriate techniques where practical, timber construction, traditional joinery, the kind of craftsmanship that had largely disappeared from commercial shipbuilding, but was still alive in a small number of workshops and among people who had made it their business to understand how wooden ships were put together in the early 17th century. The result is a ship that looks, as nearly as the builders could manage, like what the Duyfken would have looked like when it left Bantam in November of 1605. It sits low in the water. It is small, genuinely small, in a way that photographs don't quite convey until you see it next to a modern vessel. Standing on the deck, you get a physical sense of what it meant to cross open water in a ship of this size, with 20 men aboard, in the early 17th century. There is not much room. There is not much shelter. The sea, in anything but calm conditions, would have been very present. The replica has sailed extensively since its launch. It made a voyage to the Netherlands, retracing in broad terms the connection between the ship and its origins, and it has participated in various maritime events and historical commemorations. It is currently based in Western Australia and has been used as an educational resource, taking people out on the water and giving them a direct physical encounter with the scale and reality of the original voyage. There is something valuable in that, something that no amount of archival scholarship can quite replicate. Reading about a 20-metre wooden ship is one thing. Standing on the deck of one, feeling it move under you, is another. The replica's existence also raised, in a public way, a question that historians had been wrestling with for some time. What does it mean to call this voyage a discovery? The word has a complicated history. In the context of European exploration, discovery has traditionally meant the moment when a European navigator first recorded a place, first put it on a European map, first brought it into the European geographic imagination. That is a real and historically significant thing. The Duyfken's voyage did change what Europeans knew about the world, or at least what the VOC knew, even if that knowledge sat in an archive for a long time before it spread further. But the coast that the Duyfken's crew sailed along in early 1606 was not empty. It was not waiting to be found. The Aboriginal people of Western Cape York Peninsula had been living there for an almost incomprehensible length of time. Current archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians arrived on the continent at least 65,000 years ago, possibly longer. 65,000 years. To put that in some kind of proportion, the entire history of European civilization, from the earliest Greek city-states to the present day, fits inside roughly 3,000 years. The Aboriginal presence in Australia is more than 20 times older than that. The Wick people and their neighbours on Cape York had names for every river, every headland, every seasonal fishing ground along the coast that the Duyfken was carefully mapping and labelling in Dutch. They did not need to be discovered. They knew exactly where they were. This is not a simple thing to hold alongside the historical significance of Janszoon's voyage, but it is necessary to hold them together. The voyage matters. It was the beginning of a chain of events. Further Dutch exploration, eventual British colonisation, the transformation of the continent's political and demographic reality that had enormous consequences, most of them devastating for the people who were already there. Acknowledging Janszoon as the first European to reach Australia is not the same as saying that European arrival was a good thing, or that the people who were already there were somehow invisible before it happened. They were not invisible. They were present, and they had been present for longer than most of us can genuinely imagine. What the replica project tried to do, with varying degrees of success, was hold both of these things at once. The commemorations around the 400th anniversary of the voyage in 2006 included engagement with Aboriginal communities from Cape York, acknowledgement of the violent encounters that the Duyfken's crew had with the Wick people, and some effort to present the voyage not as a triumphant discovery but as a complicated beginning, the first moment of a contact that would have profound and largely painful consequences. Whether that framing fully succeeded is a matter of opinion. These things are genuinely difficult to get right, and there is no ceremony or replica ship that can undo the history that followed. But the attempt to grapple with the full complexity of the voyage, rather than simply celebrating it, was at least an honest one. What the archival recovery of the voyage makes clear, in the end, is something about how history actually works. Not the grand narrative version, but the real, documentary, evidence-based version. History is largely preserved by accident. The Duyfken's voyage survived in the record not because anyone decided it was important enough to preserve, but because the VOC was a large and well-organised institution that kept its paperwork, and because the Dutch National Archives continued to maintain that paperwork through 4 centuries of political change, war, flood, and the general entropy that destroys most human records. If the VOC had been a less bureaucratic organisation, or if the archive had been lost in one of the many disasters that have destroyed other collections, the Duyfken's voyage might have vanished entirely, leaving only the faintest traces in a few passing references. Instead it survived, and Hears found it, and subsequent scholars built on what Hears found, and eventually the voyage was recovered in enough detail to become part of the public understanding of Australian history, to generate a replica ship, to appear in school curricula and museum exhibits and documentary films, and now in narrations like this one. The chain from the actual voyage to the present moment runs through an archive in The Hague and a scholar's careful work in the 1890s, and that chain is, in its own quiet way, as remarkable as the voyage itself. There is one more thread worth pulling on before we reach the end of this story. The question of what the voyage means to Australian identity, to the history of exploration, to our understanding of how continents enter the European imagination, is not settled. It probably never will be, entirely. The debates about Portuguese precedents, about Torres's sighting, about the exact location of the landfall, about what discovery means in a context where Aboriginal Australians were already present. These are live questions, not closed ones. Historians continue to work on them, and the answers continue to shift slightly as new documents are found, new analyses are done, new perspectives are brought to the evidence. What is settled, or as settled as these things get, is the basic fact. The Duyfken reached the western coast of Cape York Peninsula in early 1606, under the command of Willem Janszoon, and the crew surveyed and mapped a stretch of that coast before turning back. That is the first documented European contact with the Australian landmass. Everything else, the interpretation, the significance, the framing, remains open to discussion. And that openness is not a weakness in the historical record. It is a sign that the history is real and complicated and still worth thinking about carefully. Which brings us finally to the question of what we make of all of it. The small ship, the forgotten man, the coast that wasn't recognised for what it was, and the 4 centuries of consequence that followed from that brief, violent, inconclusive journey south. So here we are at the end of the story, or rather, at the end of what we can tell about it, which is not quite the same thing. Picture the Duyfken one more time. 20 metres of oaken pine, 8 small guns, a crew of around 20 men, moving slowly through water that was the colour of weak tea, shallow enough in places that the hull was probably scraping silt. The sky above Cape York in early 1606 would have been enormous and flat and very bright. The mangroves along the shore would have been thick and dark and utterly silent from a distance, though of course they were not silent at all. Birds, insects, the movement of people watching from within the tree line. The crew of the Duyfken did not know where they were, not precisely. They knew they had sailed south from New Guinea. They knew they were on a coast. They were mapping it as carefully as they could, writing Dutch names onto features that already had names in languages they had never heard and would never learn. And then, at some point around 13 degrees 45 minutes south latitude, they stopped. They turned around. They went back. That is, in its bones, the whole story. A small ship arrived at a coast, stayed for a few weeks, lost 10 men in violent encounters with people who had every reason to be alarmed by their presence, and then left. The crew did not know they had found a new continent. Their commander filed his report, the chart was copied and stored, and the VOC moved on to other business. There was no celebration. No one wrote a poem about it. No portrait of Janszoon was commissioned. The voyage entered the archive and stayed there for nearly 3 centuries waiting to be found. What is remarkable is not that the voyage happened. Given the intensity of Dutch maritime expansion in that period, and the VOC's systematic drive to push into every coastline that might conceal a profit, it was almost inevitable that some Dutch ship would eventually reach Australia. What is remarkable is how completely ordinary the voyage seemed to the people who made it. They were not trying to find a continent. They were trying to find gold and trade goods. They found neither. From the VOC's perspective, the voyage was a minor disappointment, filed alongside dozens of other minor disappointments in the relentless ledger of commercial exploration. The fact that they had, in the process, become the first Europeans to set foot on a continent that would one day be home to 26 million people, that part was not visible to them. History rarely announces itself clearly at the moment it is being made. There is something almost comforting about that, in a strange way. We tend to imagine the great turning points of history as moments of drama and recognition. The explorer standing on the shore, flag in hand, understanding the weight of what has just happened. But the actual record suggests something much quieter and more confused. Janszoon's crew waded ashore, probably more than once, looking for fresh water and food, trying to communicate with people who had no reason to trust them, and eventually retreating back to the ship after things went badly wrong. The moment that historians would later call the first European contact with Australia was, from the inside, a series of frightening and confusing days on an unfamiliar coast, ending in violence and withdrawal. Not a triumph, not a recognition, just an experience that was survived and reported and then largely forgotten. And then there is the other side of that shore, the Wik people watching the Duyfken from the mangroves, or from the beach, or from their canoes, depending on exactly how those encounters unfolded, were not experiencing a moment of historical significance either, not in the way we would frame it now. They were experiencing something alarming and unprecedented. A large vessel unlike anything in their knowledge, carrying men with unfamiliar weapons and unfamiliar clothing, attempting to land on territory that was known and inhabited and defended. The violence that followed was, from their perspective, a defence. 10 of Janszoon's crew died. Zoons. We do not know how many Aboriginal people died. The records, such as they are, do not say. That asymmetry in the documentation is itself a kind of statement about whose experiences were considered worth recording. What the Wik people could not have known, and what no one on either side of those encounters could have known, was that this brief and violent meeting was the beginning of something. Not immediately. There would be no further European contact with that particular stretch of coast for years, and the full transformation of the continent would not begin for another 2 centuries. But the chain had started. The Duyfken's chart existed. Other Dutch ships would follow. Eventually the information would accumulate, and the continent would be named and claimed and settled in ways that would displace and diminish and, in too many cases, destroy the cultures that had been there for 65,000 years. None of that was visible in 1606. Oh. But it was, in some sense, already in motion. Holding all of this together, the genuine historical significance of Janszoon's voyage, the human cost of what followed, the almost accidental nature of the discovery, the absolute prior presence of Aboriginal Australians, the bureaucratic quietness with which the whole thing was received, is not easy. It requires a kind of double vision, where you can see the voyage as remarkable and see it as ordinary at the same time, where you can acknowledge Janszoon as the first European to reach Australia, and also acknowledge that the word discovery is doing a great deal of work that it cannot quite support. The land was not discovered. It was arrived at. By people who did not recognise it for what it was, in service of a company that was disappointed by what they found, on a coast that already had a name in a language that no one on the Duyfken spoke. Willem Janszoon himself vanishes from the record in the early 1620s, somewhere between the VOC's operations in the Banda Islands and a return to the Netherlands that may or may not have happened. We do not know what he looked like. We do not know if he ever told anyone about the southern coast he had surveyed, or whether by the end of his life the voyage had faded in his own memory into just another difficult season at sea among many. He had no way of knowing that 4 centuries later, people would be building a full-scale replica of his ship in Fremantle and sailing it across the world and making documentary films about the journey he had made almost by accident on his way to look for gold. He was a company man doing a company job in a world where the company's priorities were cloves and nutmeg and pepper, not geography. The geography was a byproduct. It happened to be the most consequential byproduct in the history of Australian exploration, but it was a byproduct nonetheless. There is a version of this story that wants to end with something grand, a sweeping statement about the nature of discovery, or the courage of sailors, or the long arc of history. But the Duyfken story resists that kind of ending. It is too quiet, too accidental, too unfinished. Janszoon turned back before he understood what he had found. The VOC filed the chart and moved on. The Aboriginal people of Cape York continued their lives on the coast that the Dutch had briefly and violently intruded upon, unaware that anything had fundamentally changed, and in a sense, for them, nothing had. Not yet. The change would come later, and from other directions, and in ways that dwarfed anything the Duyfken had done. What the voyage leaves us with 400 and some years later is not a clean lesson or a clear moral. It leaves us with a chart, imperfect, incomplete, connecting the Cape York coast to New Guinea in a way we now know is wrong, but recognisably depicting a real coastline that Janszoon's crew had actually sailed along. it leaves us with a name, Willem Janszoon, attached to almost no personal detail, just a rank and a ship and a voyage and a few references in company ledgers. It leaves us with the knowledge that the most significant moment in the European history of Australia was treated at the time as a minor commercial failure. And it leaves us with the understanding that the people who are most affected by the chain of events that Voyage set in motion were the ones whose perspective was least recorded, whose names were not written down, whose experience of that strange ship on their coast has to be reconstructed from inference and archaeology rather than from any document that survives. The Duyfken, the little dove, sailed back north through waters it had already crossed, back toward New Guinea, back toward Bantam, back toward the world it knew. The coast it left behind went on being itself. The tides moved in and out across the mudflats. The mangroves stood in the brown water. The birds called in the heat of the afternoon, and the people who lived there went about their lives, as they had for longer than European history can easily imagine, on a continent that a small Dutch ship had just, without quite realising it, introduced to the maps of the wider world. That is where the story ends, or where this telling of it does. Thank you genuinely for spending this time here, for listening through the whole journey, from the spice docks of Bantam to the shallow waters of Cape York and back again. If this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling is something you enjoy, it would mean a great deal if you left a like on this video, and if you are not already subscribed to Life Beyond Scene, this would be a lovely moment to do that. There are more stories like this one waiting. Quiet histories, forgotten voyages, places and people that slip through the gaps of the popular record and are worth finding again. We will be here when you are ready. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight,